Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now we begin with Story 1. The Alewife's Domain Brewing and Business in the Medieval Village. You're standing at the heart of a village in late 13th century England. The air is thick with smoke and a hint of yeast. From a humble timbered home, a woman tends to her boil pot. She is the village alewife, and her work is as essential as bread. In the medieval world, the story of beer is the story of women, particularly women known as alewives. Long before beer was industrialized or standardized by monks and brewers' guilds, it was an essential, everyday task carried out by women. Most often, the alewife brewed from necessity, for sustenance and survival, and frequently for a bit of income. Ale wasn't just a beverage. It was liquid bread, nutrient-rich, calorie-dense, and consumed at nearly every meal. With contaminated water being a common threat to health, mildly alcoholic beverages like ale became a trusted source of hydration. Not everyone knew why boiling helped, but they knew that people who drank ale lived longer. A day in the life of an alewife. Imagine waking before the sun rises, greeted by the damp smell of grain mash and yesterday's coals. The alewife begins her day grinding malted barley, or sometimes a blend of oats and wheat, depending on what's available. She may have traded for her grain or grown it herself. After grinding, the malt is soaked in hot water to create a thick mash, stirred in a large wooden tun or copper cauldron. As the mash is left to steep, the room steams warm and heavy with the scent of wet bread. Next comes the process of lautering, draining the sugary liquid, called wort, from the mash. This is where the real magic begins. The alewife then boils the wort, often for hours. The boil sterilizes it and prepares it for fermentation. At this point, gruit, a mixture of herbs like bog myrtle, yarrow, or wild rosemary, might be added for flavor and preservation. Hops were not yet widespread in England. Their use would come much later. For now, the ale is earthy, sour, and often thick with suspended particles. It is cloudy, warm, and barely alcoholic. After cooling, the ale is transferred to wooden barrels or ceramic jugs, left in a cool corner to ferment naturally from wild yeasts in the air or from remnants of prior batches, what today might be called backslopping. No one fully understood the microbiology, but they knew when fermentation had taken hold, the bubbling would begin. Brewing as a domestic economy. Unlike large-scale production in monasteries or urban brewhouses, village brewing was a cottage industry. It was unpredictable and often seasonal. Many alewives only brewed in small batches, setting out an ale stake, a long pole or broom above their doorway to signal that fresh ale was ready for sale. This was the medieval equivalent of turning on the neon "open" sign. It was rarely a full-time occupation. Instead, alewives were usually widows, single women, or married women supplementing household income. Brewing brought autonomy in an era with few avenues for female independence. There was, of course, risk. A batch might spoil, fermentation might fail, rain could dampen the firewood, and competition was fierce in villages where 2 or 3 women might brew. Loyalty was won not by branding, but by flavor, freshness, and how well the ale sat in the belly come morning. The ale taster and quality control. With beer so central to daily life, some form of quality control was essential. Enter the aledasters, local officials tasked with inspecting the strength, purity, and cost of ale. Their tools were rudimentary: a ladle, a taste for proper flavor, and a nose trained to detect rot or contamination. If an alewife's product was too weak, too strong, or sold above the customary price, she could be fined. Records from manor courts tell us of countless alewives being brought up on such charges. But interestingly, these fines were often symbolic, a few pennies at most. It was less about punishment and more about ensuring community trust. Yet over time, as towns grew and regulation increased, many alewives found themselves squeezed by bureaucracy. Men, particularly those forming early brewing guilds, began to dominate the commercial sphere. But for centuries, it was women who carried the fermentation torch. Brewing tools and the layout of the brew space. A typical alewife's brew space was often a corner of the kitchen, though some households had dedicated sheds. Tools included a copper boiling pot, a wooden mash tun, barrels for fermenting, cloths for straining, and sometimes even a filtering trough filled with straw or heather. Everything had to be cleaned as best as one could without modern sanitation, because even the smallest contamination could ruin an entire batch. Ale was perishable. Without refrigeration or hops as a preservative, most batches were consumed within a day or two. Left longer, the brew could sour, attracting flies or forming a pellicle of wild mold. And yet people loved it, drank it, needed it. Gender superstition and the alewife's image. By the late Middle Ages, the image of the alewife had become complicated. On one hand, she was a respected member of village life. On the other, a growing web of superstition and suspicion began to surround her. Alewives were often depicted in woodcuts and illustrations with a pointed hat, cat, and cauldron imagery that would, by the early modern period, morph into the visual language of the witch. There is little coincidence here. The woman who controlled mysterious processes, who earned her own income, and who brewed potions from bubbling vats. She was a figure to both respect and fear. Add to this the occasional spoiled batch, unexplained illness, or drunken quarrel, and the alewife could become a scapegoat. Was this fear rooted in her economic independence, or in the intoxicating power of the drink she made? It's difficult to say, but the transition from trusted brewer to potential witch did not happen overnight. And yet, despite it all, the brewing continued. Why ale and not wine? You might wonder, why was ale the default drink and not wine? The answer is partly agricultural and partly economic. In Northern Europe, grapes were difficult to grow. Vineyards were rare and precious, and wine was mostly reserved for the nobility or ecclesiastical settings. It was imported, taxed, and expensive. Ale, by contrast, could be made from local grain, by almost anyone with the skill and patience. Ale was democratic, a drink for the plowman and the parson alike. And so, in cottages across medieval England, the alewife continued her work, filling the homes and hearts of the village with warmth and liquid sustenance. But as the 14th century gave way to the 15th, everything began to change. The rise of hopped beer, imports from the Low Countries, and shifts in guild power would alter the brewing landscape forever. The comforting clatter of brewing tools and the subtle yeasty scent that once signaled prosperity for the village alewife began, quietly and slowly, to be challenged. It was not a sudden overthrow, rather, a creeping transformation carried by trade winds, taxation rolls, and a small, bitter flower that would change brewing forever: the hop. By the 15th century, the brewing world of England, long dominated by the traditional, lightly fermented, gruit-flavored ale, found itself at a crossroads. The age of hops had arrived. The arrival of the hop and the birth of beer. To a modern listener, it might sound odd to distinguish between ale and beer. But in the medieval context, the two were not interchangeable. Ale was traditionally unhopped and flavored with herbal mixtures often gathered locally. Beer, by contrast, was imported in concept, containing hops that gave it a longer shelf life and a distinct, bitter taste. The earliest mention of hopped beer in England appears around the early 1400s, tied to Dutch and Flemish immigrants in East Anglia and southeastern port towns like Sandwich, Colchester, and London. These immigrants brought with them not only their knowledge of hopped brewing, but also a cultural preference for stronger, longer-lasting beverages products better suited to trade and storage. Hops, it turned out, were a preservative marvel. Their acidic and antibacterial properties prevented spoilage, dramatically extending the drink's shelf life. Where traditional ale might sour in 2 days, hopped beer could remain drinkable for weeks or more, a logistical miracle for growing towns and merchants. Yet for the traditional alewife, this wasn't good news. Resistance and regulations, ale versus beer. The introduction of beer was initially met with resistance not just from individual brewers, but from the English legal and cultural system. For decades, authorities made a clear regulatory distinction between ale and beer, often taxing them differently and requiring separate licenses to brew and sell each. This was, in part, protectionism. Hopped beer was a foreign product, brewed by foreigners, sold in a market already dominated by native ale. To understand this brewing battleground, one must look at municipal regulations, particularly in London. Guilds and brewers began to lobby for official recognition and standardization. By the mid-15th century, there were separate guilds for ale brewers and beer brewers. Eventually, these would merge, but not before a long period of tension and competition. While men increasingly filled the ranks of the growing beer guilds, alewives found themselves left behind. Where once any woman with a cauldron, grain, and a good mash could brew, now regulations required inspections, certifications, taxes, and standardization, all costly in both time and coin. The slow transition from informal cottage brewing to regulated commercial brewing marginalized many women. The alewife's disappearing power. It's important to remember that for centuries, the household was the hub of production. Women were the producers of textiles, food, ale. They sustained the economy of the home, and by extension, the village. But as brewing professionalized and became a trade, women were increasingly pushed out of the public commercial sphere. Why? Part of it was legal ownership. Married women had little to no formal economic agency. If a husband took on brewing as a trade, the ale was under his name. Even if a woman had brewed it herself, often literally, she had no legal claim. Another factor was the rise of urbanization. As cities grew and markets expanded, brewing shifted from small-batch home production to large-scale operations in purpose-built brewhouses. These required capital, infrastructure, and connections, domains in which men dominated, especially through guild systems. In places like London and York, records show women being admitted into guilds less and less often after 1450. The alewife's role, so central to the medieval village, was now increasingly viewed as outmoded, quaint, or even suspicious. The slander of the alewife. As women's visibility in brewing waned, their reputations also took a hit. Late medieval literature and moralist sermons began to depict alewives as dishonest, drunken, and morally suspect. In satirical poetry and public caricature, the once essential alewife was lampooned, a figure who watered down ale, added unsavory ingredients, or tempted good Christian men into vice. You can find her in woodcuts, haggard, toothless, with a cat on her shoulder and a foaming jug in hand. She is often shown cheating customers, slipping slugs into their cups to add weight or slopping stale ale into fresh jugs. This image was not just humorous, it was corrosive. It tied the independent female brewer to vice, greed, and even witchcraft. By the 16th century, as witch trials gained traction across Europe, the visual language of the alewife bled into that of the witch. The pointed hat, originally worn for visibility in the market, the broom, once used as a marketing signal, and the bubbling cauldron. All practical tools, now laden with suspicion. It's important not to overstate the directness of this transformation. Not every alewife was branded a witch, but the cultural shift is undeniable. As brewing became industrialized and masculinized, the women who had once dominated it were first mocked, then erased. Surviving the shift, who remained? Some alewives did adapt. Historical records mention women who ran inns or public houses, extending their brewing into hospitality. Others partnered with husbands or male relatives to maintain brewing rights under new guild systems. In small rural villages, far from the eyes of guild inspectors, women continued to brew quietly well into the 16th and even 17th centuries. But their dominance was never again what it had been in the 1200s and 1300s. The brewing world, like much of pre-modern industry, moved from the feminine domestic sphere into the masculine professional sphere. And with it went a vital, often invisible slice of women's economic history: the quiet extinction of gruit. It wasn't just the alewives who lost out. The shift to hopped beer also meant the decline of gruit, that rich, aromatic blend of herbs once central to ale making. Gruit had been more than a flavoring agent. It was regional, seasonal, and even sacred, drawing on plants known for their medicinal or ritual properties. Yarrow, for example, was thought to ward off illness. Bog myrtle had astringent qualities. Heather could lend floral notes. But hops were more efficient. They preserved better, standardized the flavor, and simplified trade. Over time, local gruit traditions faded, often legislated out of existence by emerging brewing laws. What was lost was more than taste. It was a connection to the land, to local knowledge, and to the millennia-old practice of gathering and brewing by intuition. The Reformation and the changing drinking table. By the late 1500s, the Protestant Reformation had swept across Europe, bringing not only religious change but also social restructuring. In England, under Henry VIII and later Elizabeth I, the dissolution of the monasteries and the rise of centralized authority further transformed the brewing landscape. Monasteries, once bastions of organized brewing, especially in wine-poor regions, were shuttered. Lands were privatized. Brewing passed into the hands of merchant classes, who now built large operations, some capable of producing hundreds of barrels per week. Drinking, too, changed. Where once communal alehouses had served villagers who brought their own cups and drank standing, new public houses emerged with furniture, tankards, and food, the earliest versions of modern pubs. These establishments were increasingly male-dominated spaces, excluding women from both behind and in front of the bar. The alewife had no place here. The irony of erasure. The irony of this entire transformation is stark. The drink that had sustained medieval life, made safe by the hands of women, flavored by wild herbs, sold one mug at a time, had been overtaken by a version with longer shelf life, professional control, and male gatekeepers. Yet every time a tankard of ale was raised, it still bore the legacy of those original alewives. Their techniques, their instincts, even their tools, were the foundation of what brewing had become. Still, there is one final evolution of the alewife story yet to be told, a chapter where modern brewing sees a resurrection of her legacy, but we are not there yet. As the curtain closed on the medieval brewing era, one question lingers. What would become of the village alewife's knowledge in a world that no longer saw her? Imagine a cup raised in a modern tavern, rich with the floral bitterness of hops and a creamy head. Few drinkers pause to consider that, centuries ago, a woman in a soot-stained apron stood over a bubbling cauldron, crafting the foundations of this very experience. Though largely forgotten by history, the alewife never truly disappeared. She lingers in recipes, rituals, and the quiet resurgence of ancient brewing ways. The disappearance and persistence of domestic brewing. As the 17th century wore on, the professionalization of brewing was nearly complete in England and much of Northern Europe. Guilds had merged, breweries expanded, and regulation codified every step of the brewing process from ingredients and strength to sale and taxation. Brewing, once part of the domestic fabric, was now largely the domain of commercial enterprises. But history, like yeast, is never truly dormant. In rural households, especially among the poor or in areas far from market towns, domestic brewing never entirely died. Instead, it became quieter, less visible, and largely undocumented. Women still brewed, but mostly for their families, rarely for sale, and without the community stake that once marked their labor as central to village life. They continued to pass down recipes by word of mouth: how much barley to use when the mash had steeped long enough, how to recognize a good ferment by smell alone. These were women's sciences, rooted in lived experience, oral tradition, and a sense of intuition that defied written record. Even as beer became a commercial product, the art of small-batch home brewing endured in corners, cottages, and kitchens, a quiet rebellion against the loss of craft. Colonial transmissions, women and brewing in the New World. When settlers crossed the Atlantic, they carried brewing knowledge with them, and in many cases, it was women who kept that knowledge alive in the face of hardship. In colonial North America, women resumed their role as primary brewers, often by necessity. Imported beer was expensive and unreliable. Homemade ale, brewed from corn, wheat, or rye, filled the gap. Even the wives of prominent leaders Martha Washington, for instance, managed brewing operations within their households. Brewing manuals from the 18th century, like The Complete Housewife, included ale recipes specifically written for women. These guides helped maintain a tradition already in retreat in Europe, giving it a second life in new soil. And yet, as in England, the commercialization of brewing would follow closely. By the mid-19th century, industrial breweries, nearly all run by men, overtook the small home-based operations. The alewife's second act, like her first, faded into the background. The 19th century and the masculinization of brewing. The Industrial Revolution finalized what the late Middle Ages had begun. Brewing moved from firelit homes to steam-powered factories, producing in quantities unimaginable to medieval brewers. This was also the age of the chemist brewer. Brewing ceased to be art and became science. Figures like Louis Pasteur demystified fermentation in the 1860s, identifying yeast not as wild chance, but as a living organism with predictable behavior. This discovery revolutionized brewing, but also drove a further wedge between old and new methods. Women, still largely excluded from the scientific and commercial realms, were once again pushed further from the brewhouse. By 1900, in both Europe and America, beer had become a man's drink, brewed by men, marketed to men, and consumed in male-dominated spaces like pubs, beer halls, and sporting events. And yet, in cookbooks, diaries, and whispered family traditions, the traces of the alewife endured. The 20th century, silence, memory, and the seeds of revival. The 20th century was largely silent on the subject of women brewers. World wars, prohibition, and industrial consolidation reshaped the beer landscape. Brewing conglomerates controlled production, pushing out smaller brewers and homogenizing taste. But with silence came preservation. In rural Eastern Europe, Ireland, and parts of Scandinavia, women continued to brew traditional beverages often not called beer, but rather kvass, soddy, kvassir, or small ale. These drinks weren't sold commercially and rarely recorded in formal histories, but they were living traditions, passed between generations. And in the 1970s, a shift began. The homebrewing movement emerged in Britain and the United States, often as a countercultural response to the blandness of industrial beer. Hobbyists, many of them women, sought to reclaim the old methods, experimenting with herbs, spices, open fermentation, and ancient grains. Books like the Sacred and Herbal Healing Beers by Stephen Harrod Booner explored the ethnobotanical roots of brewing, reviving knowledge about gruit herbs lost since the age of the alewife. A new generation discovered that the pre-modern brewing world was not only rich, it was deeply feminine. The alewife returns, women in modern brewing. In the 21st century, we see something unexpected, a resurgence of women in brewing not only as hobbyists, but as professionals, historians, and entrepreneurs. Organizations like Pink Boots Society support women in the beer industry worldwide. In Scotland, Belgium, and New England, craft brewers, some intentionally reclaiming the name alewife, have begun producing gruit ales and small-batch medieval-inspired beers. Some recreate recipes using archaeological evidence, historic cookbooks, and fermentation methods once deemed archaic. Others blend modern science with tradition, using lab-cultured yeast strains to replicate the wild fermentations of centuries past. It is not just nostalgia. It is a reckoning, a restoration of the untold part of brewing history. The alewife, once sidelined and mocked, is being re-examined not as a curiosity, but as a central figure in the story of human survival and innovation. Brewing and survival, the deeper thread. Perhaps the most compelling reason to revisit the alewife story is not just for accuracy, but for what it tells us about resilience. In a world where water was often unsafe, ale was essential. Its production required knowledge of temperature control, sanitation, even if not fully understood, supply management and timing. It was the backbone of public health before germ theory. The alewife was not a curiosity, she was a public health worker, a nutritionist, and an economic actor. Her disappearance from history books is not only a result of patriarchy, it is also a reflection of what we value as important. The mundane, the domestic, the everyday, these things often escape documentation, but without them, society falters. In every flagon of frothy ale raised in a medieval hall, there was a thread that led back to a woman stirring a pot over a smoky fire, listening carefully to the sound of fermentation begin. Echoes in the mug, what we inherit. Today's beer drinkers rarely think about gruit or alewives, just as wine drinkers rarely ponder amphory or Roman irrigation. But those old stories persist, hidden in the shapes of glasses, in the tastes of herbs, in the rituals of hospitality. Even the term brewster, once a gendered feminine word for a woman brewer, has returned, in some corners reclaimed, revitalized, and reimagined. In the end, the alewife story is a reminder that history is not always told through battles and kings, but through cups shared, skills practiced, and quiet labors repeated over generations. She may have vanished from the village square, but she never left our tables. So the next time you lift a mug, whether of ale, beer, mead, or spiced cider, pause for just a moment and consider who first brewed this for you, and whose hands, forgotten by history, still echo in the cup you hold. Story 2. Wine for the monk's sacred fermentation in the abbey cellars. You awaken to the gentle clinking of glass and the damp, musty scent of stone walls. It's just past lauds, the early morning prayer, and the monks have already begun their quiet work in the cloistered vineyard. The year is 878, and tucked deep within the hills of Burgundy, vines twist and curl across plots cared for not by farmers or merchants, but by men of the cloth. From sacrament to sustenance, why wine mattered to monks. Wine has long held a sacred place in Christian ritual, a symbol of Christ's blood in the Eucharist. It was essential for Mass, but in the early centuries following the fall of Rome, wine became more than symbolic. For the monastic orders emerging across Europe, particularly under the rule of Saint Benedict, wine was a form of survival both spiritually and economically. The monasteries, isolated communities of men bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, required a self-sufficient system. They grew their own food, milled their own grain, raised livestock, and fermented their own drink. Wine, therefore, became both a ritual obligation and a practical necessity. It was cleaner than water, preserved well, and could be stored in cool cellar spaces carved into monastery hillsides. It became an item of trade, a source of hospitality for pilgrims, and a way to fund alms and expansion. While beer dominated the north, the vine was a southern legacy inherited from the Romans and lovingly tended by the monks of Gaul, Italy, Spain, and parts of the Rhineland. The cloistered vineyard, a monastic innovation. Imagine the vineyard of a 9th century Benedictine abbey. It is not a sprawling commercial estate. It is segmented, structured, and deeply tied to the rhythms of the monastic calendar. Each day was divided into hours of prayer and labor. The ora et labora of Benedictine life and vineyard care was integrated into this sacred routine. Tasks were carefully distributed among the brethren. Tending the vines was a slow, methodical process. Leaves were pruned to allow sunlight in, and vines were trained along wooden trellises. Harvesting, usually in late September, was a communal affair done in silence, under the watchful eye of the cellarer or vineyard master. Fermentation took place in large oak casks, in shadowy underground spaces cooled naturally by stone. Storage and bottling, though true bottling didn't come until much later, followed meticulous routines. Wine was decanted into amphorae or leather sacks for short transport, and into wooden barrels for aging. The monks even recorded their practices in illuminated manuscripts, detailing soil treatments, seasonal weather patterns, and grape varietals. Over time, this accumulated into a corpus of viticultural knowledge unmatched by any other medieval institution. The rule of Saint Benedict and moderation in drinking. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, prescribed moderation in all things including wine. Chapter 40 states, "We read that wine is not at all necessary for monks, but since the monks of our day cannot be persuaded of this, let us at least agree to drink sparingly." In practice, this meant roughly half a liter of wine per monk per day, more in cold weather, less in summer. This might sound excessive to a modern ear, but keep in mind that wine at the time was often diluted with water, and fermentation levels were naturally lower than modern wines. Wine was not a luxury. It was a regulated comfort, a safe source of hydration, and a way to maintain health, especially as many monastic communities were vegetarian or consumed meat only on feast days. What's interesting is how monks, despite this moderation, became some of the most skilled vintners in Europe, not in pursuit of pleasure, but of quality and durability. In order to best serve the liturgy, their guests, and their own survival, wine needed to last and taste good. The abbey as agricultural powerhouse. By the 10th century, abbeys were not just spiritual centers, they were agrarian powerhouses. Some of the best-known wine-producing monastic orders included the Benedictines, who established vineyards in places like Cluny and Monte Cassino; the Cistercians, a reformist offshoot who emphasized simplicity but became masters of Burgundy's cooler climates; the Carthusians, known for strict isolation and herbal liquors, who also maintained vines in their isolated alpine lands. These monks kept meticulous records. They noted sun exposure, grape variety, soil type, and pruning techniques. Over generations, this created a proto-scientific viticultural method that influenced European wine for centuries. In fact, some of the earliest known notions of terroir, the idea that geography imparts flavor, can be traced to monastic writings. Monks observed that south-facing hillsides produced richer wines than those in shadowed valleys. They passed this knowledge on, monk to monk, across decades. Hospitality and the guesthouse cellar. According to monastic rule, hospitality was sacred. Anyone beggar or noble who arrived at the abbey gates had to be received, as if it were Christ himself. Wine played a crucial role in this hospitality. Guests were served food and wine from the guesthouse cellar, which was often stocked with better vintages than those allocated to the monks. These guest quarters functioned as early medieval inns, offering respite to pilgrims, clergy, and sometimes even royal envoys. Over time, monasteries began selling surplus wine, especially those with prime vineyard land. This commercial success was often reinvested into charitable work, manuscript copying, and construction, including cathedrals and libraries. The quiet labor of wine, thus, helped fund the preservation of knowledge itself. Vine and violence, the dangers beyond the walls. Monastic vineyards weren't immune to the dangers of the wider world. Raiding, warfare, and shifting political tides often brought ruin to carefully tended vines. Viking incursions in the 9th century burned vineyards in Normandy and Brittany. In Central Europe, feuding lords would plunder abbey lands, uprooting years of agricultural labor. And yet monks replanted, over and over. In many ways, monastic viticulture is a story of resilience of cultivation as an act of faith. Tending vines that would not bear fruit for years was a testament to long-term thinking and a devotion to the slow pace of creation. It was also a form of protest against chaos to plant, ferment, and store, while kingdoms rose and fell outside the cloister wall. The science of stillness. What made monastic wine so consistently good, despite primitive tools? In a word, control. Monasteries offered an environment of stillness, ritual, and consistency. Vats were cleaned thoroughly. Fermentation spaces were kept at stable temperatures. There was no rush. Wine was aged as long as necessary, not as fast as possible. And perhaps most crucially, monks documented everything. In an age before widespread scientific publication, monastic records were the closest thing to a scientific journal written by hand, passed from cellarer to novice. These weren't just monks. They were data-collecting farmers with spiritual mandates, and their attention to detail created something close to wine excellence long before Bordeaux or Burgundy gained fame. The legacy in your glass. Today, some of the most prestigious wine regions in the world, Champagne, Burgundy, the Rheingau, owe their viticultural foundations to monastic care. Estates like Clos de Vougeot in France and Kloster Eberbach in Germany began as abbey vineyards. Modern winemakers still follow principles laid down 1,000 years ago. Soil matching, vine spacing, fermentation timing, and aging conditions all pioneered behind cloistered walls. The difference, of course, is that the monks did it without seeking profit, without marketing campaigns, and without recognition. It was sacred labor. And yet the deeper impact of their work was not only on wine. It was on knowledge, resilience, and the idea that stillness could produce greatness slowly, deliberately, and with purpose. But as the late medieval period approached, monastic influence began to wane. Political reform, secular pressures, and even scandal crept into the cloisters. How did the monks hold onto their vineyards in a world turning increasingly worldly? The sun now hangs lower over the vine-covered hills. In the shadow of the abbey walls, the cellar grows cool and quiet. Barrels rest beneath wooden arches, aging slowly, undisturbed. But outside, the world no longer slumbers. Lords rise against kings. Merchants challenge abbots. And across Europe, a new kind of thirst begins to stir, one not just for wine, but for the profits it could bring. A new demand, when sacred becomes saleable. In the early medieval period, wine was a product of necessity and sacrament. But by the 12th and 13th centuries, it began to evolve into something more, an economic asset. The expansion of towns, the growth of long-distance trade routes, and the emergence of wealthy merchant classes created a broader market for wine, especially wine of high quality. And where better to find it than the meticulously maintained vineyards of the monastic orders? Monks, particularly in France, Germany, and northern Italy, found themselves at the center of an unintentional revolution. They had the land, the knowledge, and the infrastructure to meet the rising demand. Abbeys like Cluny, Cytox, and Eberbach became famous not only for spiritual discipline, but for the wine their cellars could produce. But this shift raised an uneasy question. Could a vow of poverty coexist with a thriving wine business? The Cistercian model, simplicity meets sophistication. No order navigated this better than the Cistercians. Founded in 1098 as a stricter, more austere offshoot of the Benedictines, the Cistercians initially rejected what they saw as the decadence of Cluniac monasteries, ornate churches, lavish meals, and too much comfort. They embraced manual labor, poverty, and simplicity. And yet, paradoxically, they became some of the most sophisticated vintners of the medieval world. In Burgundy, they established Clos de Vougeot, one of the first walled vineyards or clos, designed for maximum control and consistency. They innovated in vineyard layout, planting by elevation and sun exposure, and created a legacy of parceling land based on microclimates, an early form of what we now call terroir classification. The wine was made not for indulgence, but for function to support the order, fund the poor, and maintain monastic houses. Still, by the 13th century, some Cistercian abbeys were exporting wine as far as England and Flanders. How did they reconcile this with their vows? Simple, the monks didn't sell the wine directly. They worked through lay brothers, also called conversi, who handled physical labor and secular interactions. It was an elegant workaround, one that allowed the monastery to maintain spiritual purity while engaging, indirectly, in a robust economy. Wine feudalism and power. Land ownership in medieval Europe was not simple. Abbeys often held their vineyards in feudal tenure, granted by kings, dukes, or bishops. These lands could include not only vineyards but entire villages, fields, and serfs, all of which required governance. The abbots thus found themselves in increasingly secular roles, managing estates, arbitrating disputes, and crucially collecting taxes. In return, they were expected to provide spiritual services, military prayers, and sometimes material contributions like wine for noble courts. This created tension. Nobles began to eye monastic wealth with suspicion. Why did the abbey have so many acres? Why did their wine fetch higher prices than that of noble vineyards? Why were abbots living in large residences, even palaces? By the 14th century, the once insulated world of the monastic vintner was no longer isolated. It was entangled in political power struggles, land disputes, and class dynamics. Even the Pope began to question the balance between monastic humility and economic influence. The Avignon papacy and shifting religious authority. Between 1309 and 1377, the papacy was relocated from Rome to Avignon, in southern France. This period, known as the Avignon papacy, had a surprising impact on monastic wine production. The papal court in Avignon demanded high-quality sacramental wine in large quantities and local vineyards, including those managed by religious orders, sprang into action. The Rhone Valley became a hub of production. Even secular producers found a market boom thanks to the church's need for wine. The result: blurring of lines between sacred and secular production. Increased reliance on lay vintners and tenant labor. Expansion of wine export to serve not just churches, but royal and urban elites. Monasteries, still sworn to poverty, increasingly rented out land rather than managing vineyards directly. This move distanced them from the physical labor of winemaking, allowing them to profit from it without violating their vows, at least in appearance. But the further they stepped away from the vine, the closer they came to scrutiny. The rise of urban guilds and secular competition. As wine demand increased, so too did urban viticulture and commercial brewing. Merchants, no longer reliant on monastic stock, began developing their own vineyards, bottling methods, and taverns. In cities like Paris, Cologne, and Florence, wine guilds formed to protect quality and regulate competition. These guilds were explicitly secular and sometimes hostile to monastic producers who were exempt from many taxes and regulations. Arguments erupted over rights to sell wine in town, pricing, and market access. Records from the 14th and 15th centuries document lawsuits filed by secular vintners against abbeys for undercutting prices, claiming unfair economic advantage. The monks, once the undisputed masters of fermentation, now faced competition, legal obstacles, and growing resentment. It wasn't just about wine anymore. It was about control. Crisis and decline, war, plague, and reformation. The late medieval period brought profound challenges. The Black Death, 1347–1351, decimated monastic populations, killing experienced cellars and vineyard workers. The 100 Years' War devastated farmland across France, including prized vineyards. Looting and occupation by armies, both French and English, saw wine barrels confiscated or vineyards burned. Monasteries struggled to maintain their holdings. Some began leasing land permanently to secular tenants, effectively abandoning direct wine production. And then came the Reformation. Beginning in 1517, with Martin Luther's 95 Theses, the Protestant Reformation attacked many of the Church's economic privileges, including land ownership and commercial activities like wine trade. In Protestant regions, monastic orders were dissolved. Their lands were seized, and their wine operations ended. In England, the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VII, 1536–1541, stripped abbeys of their vineyards. Much of this land was sold to nobles and merchants, who commercialized the operations. Across northern Europe, centuries of sacred fermentation came to a sudden and often violent end. What remained in the casks? Despite the losses, some Catholic regions preserved monastic wine culture. In southern Germany, Austria, Italy, and parts of France, abbeys like Klosterneuburg, Chartres, and Mount La Verne retained their vineyards. Some survived by adapting, producing small volumes, focusing on liturgical use, or partnering with secular vintners. Others pivoted to herbal elixirs and fortified wines, birthing famous products like Benedictine liqueur and Chartreuse, made by Carthusian monks. These were not table wines, but tonics, digestifs, and medicinal spirits that commanded high value. But the golden age of monastic winemaking, when monks were the unrivaled masters of fermentation, was over. Still, their influence lingered. Their quiet legacy. Even as the wine trade moved into secular hands, the monastic blueprint remained. Carefully maintained vineyards, barrel aging techniques, classification of land by microclimate, emphasis on cleanliness, documentation, and patience. The vineyard, once a place of prayer, had become a template for precision agriculture. And in this quiet legacy, we glimpse a strange truth. Though the world outside the abbey grew noisier, with merchants shouting, soldiers marching, and reformers preaching inside the cellar, the method endured. Stone walls, oak casks, and cool air remained a constant rhythm against the rising tide of change. But even in this endurance, there was loss. The monks had not only made wine, they had made time itself bend to purpose. They had turned fermentation into a prayer, and now the cellar belonged to commerce. Would the sacred ever return to the vine? The old abbey stands still. Its vineyards stretch across the hills like green scripture etched into the earth. Though centuries have passed and many of its halls have fallen silent, something endures. The wine is still made here slowly, reverently, and with every drop, a piece of monastic memory is preserved. remnants in the ruins, what survived the secular tide. By the 17th century, the landscape of European wine had changed beyond recognition. The dissolution of the monasteries, the Protestant Reformation, and the 30 Years' War had all but severed the institutional continuity of most monastic vineyards. Yet a surprising number survived in fragments. In France, abbeys like Abbé de Saint-Hilaire quietly continued producing Blanquette, a predecessor to sparkling wine. In Germany, Kloster Eberbach, though secularized, retained its vineyards and winemaking operations, passing into state or private control but maintaining its monastic methods. In Austria, Stift Klosterneuburg still claims to be the oldest existing winery in the country, producing wine since 1114. These sites endured not because they escaped change, but because their foundations were so strong that they could weather the storm of centuries. Even when the monks were gone, their stone-terraced vineyards, grape selections, and cellaring techniques remained. Their knowledge had become embedded not only in books, but in the land itself. Wine and the Catholic Revival. In the wake of the Reformation, the Catholic Church, under the Counter-Reformation, sought to reclaim influence not only through theology and art, but also through rebuilding its monastic institutions. New and reformed religious orders emerged, and with them came a modest return to monastic agriculture, including viticulture. This wasn't just about commerce, it was about ritual purity. The Eucharist still required wine, and local production allowed for liturgical control, ensuring that wine used in the Mass was made according to spiritual and ecclesiastical standards. Orders such as the Jesuits even spread monastic winemaking to the New World, in places like Chile, where Jesuits planted vines in the 16th century, forming the backbone of South American wine culture. California, where Mission San Juan Capistrano, 1776, and others established vineyards, bringing the sacred vine to a new continent. Though not monks in the strictest medieval sense, these missionaries carried forward the same principle. Wine made with care could sanctify a moment, a ritual, or a life. From vow to vintage, monks in the modern world. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as Europe stabilized after the Napoleonic Wars and subsequent revolutions, some monasteries returned to their roots. Among the most notable examples, the Benedictines of Buckfast Abbey in Devon, England, re-established in the 1880s, created Buckfast tonic wine, originally intended as a medicinal drink, now infamous for other reasons in modern Britain. The Carthusian monks of Chartres, who still produce the bright green herbal liqueur of the same name, developed from a secret recipe in the 18th century. Trappist monks in Belgium, while more famous for their beer, also engage in winemaking and viticulture in small quantities, with the same attention to craft and spiritual discipline. In all these cases, monastic communities revived not just their agricultural traditions, but their economic independence. These products allowed them to remain self-sufficient just as Benedict's rule had once envisioned. Importantly, modern monastic winemaking shuns mass production. It is limited, intentional, and focused on quality. Even the branding is minimal. The work is still an offering, not a transaction. Rediscovering the ancient cellars. Today, archaeologists and wine historians are rediscovering monastic wine heritage buried beneath layers of time. In Burgundy, the remnants of Cistercian walls still mark the boundaries of legendary vineyards like Clos de Vougiat and Romanée Conti. In the Rheingau region of Germany, Old Abbey records detailed planting patterns and vintages dating back to the 12th century data, still referenced by modern viticulturists. Even in England, thought to be too cold for wine after Roman times, monastic vineyards are being unearthed and revived, using DNA analysis to trace historic grape varieties and reconstruct ancient terroir. this is more than academic curiosity. It is a quiet act of cultural remembrance, a way to honor the men who, in silence and prayer, shaped Europe's wine heritage not by conquest, but by cultivation. Spiritual agriculture, the philosophy behind the vines. What truly set monastic wine apart was not just technique, but intention. Monastic agriculture followed the principle that labor was a form of worship. Tending vines was not separate from prayer, it was prayer. The soil was sacred, the yield a blessing, the fermentation a mystery to be revered, not mastered. This spiritual agriculture involved observation, noting how vines responded to weather, soil, and pruning. Patience, allowing wine to mature over years, not weeks. Gratitude, seeing abundance as a gift to be shared, not exploited. Even today, those who make wine in the monastic tradition speak not only of craft, but of care, a gentle stewardship of the land rather than a manipulation of it. And perhaps that is why monastic wine still commands such reverence. It is not just about what you taste, it's about the quiet values that linger in every drop. The eternal lessons in a glass. So what then is the legacy of monastic winemaking? It is not found solely in award-winning vintages or ancient abbey labels. Rather, it lies in the principles that monastic life brought to the vineyard. Rhythm, aligning work with the natural and spiritual cycles of the year. Balance, resisting excess, honoring simplicity. Preservation, documenting, protecting, and improving over generations. In an age of accelerated consumption, the monks remind us that the best things ripen slowly. That tending a vine for decades or copying a manuscript for years is not inefficient, it is devotional. Their legacy is in the idea that you can build something lasting, even in silence. The sacred vine today. In recent years, there has been a growing renewal of interest in monastic beverages, not just wine, but also beer, cider, and liqueurs. Pilgrims visit monasteries not only for spiritual retreats, but for tastings, vineyard walks, and glimpses of that ancient way of life. Some modern wineries are explicitly returning to monastic values: minimal intervention, biodynamic farming, community ownership, and even silence during harvest. And in the cellars of active monasteries, from Mount Athos in Greece to Novicella Abbey in South Tyrol, wine is still made as it always was, carefully, quietly, faithfully. No loud machinery, no corporate branding, just the slow pulse of fermentation in oak barrels beneath vaulted stone ceilings. A final pour. As you sip your next glass of wine, whether from a supermarket or a rare vintage bottle, consider that it was once sacred. Not just because it represented the blood of Christ, but because it came from a worldview that saw labor as sacred, land as a gift, and time as a slow unfolding of meaning. In the ancient monasteries of Europe, wine was never just a drink. It was a prayer in liquid form. Story 3. Mead and myth, honey, rituals, and rural reverence. You find yourself in a clearing deep within a forest. A wooden cup passes through rough-hewn hands beside a fire. The liquid inside is golden, viscous, and slightly sweet. It is mead, the drink of warriors, saints, and farmers alike. This is not a feast in a castle hall, but a midsummer gathering in the long dusk of the northern world, where honey and water ferment into a drink older than kingdoms. What is mead, and why did it matter? Mead, often called the drink of the gods, predates recorded history. At its simplest, it is a combination of honey, water, and time left to ferment until it bubbles and warms with alcohol. But in early medieval Europe, mead was far more than a rustic beverage. It was a symbol, a sustenance, and a story. Before vineyards pushed north and alehouses multiplied across villages, mead held a place of esteem, particularly in northern and eastern Europe regions where grapes struggled but bees thrived. Wherever honey could be harvested from tree hollows, clay pots, or woven skeps, mead could be made. And so, across Anglo-Saxon England, Viking Scandinavia, Celtic Wales, and the deep forests of Slavic lands, mead became not only a drink of ceremony, but also a part of daily rural life. Honey, the sacred ingredient. Honey was both a luxury and a staple in the medieval world. It was one of the few available sweeteners before the widespread trade of sugar, and it served in medicine, preservation, and religious offerings. But perhaps most importantly, it was deeply respected, even spiritually significant. In many early belief systems, bees were thought to be divine messengers or sacred animals. Their product honey was imbued with healing and even mystical properties. The bee's industrious nature, its mysterious hive life, and its role in pollination tied it intimately to ideas of fertility, order, and divine wisdom. Christian monks kept bee colonies not just for wax to make candles for churches, but for honey, which they often used in tonics, salves, and sacramental wines. In pre-Christian traditions, bees were often seen as keepers of knowledge, and the act of gathering honey was sometimes ritualized. Therefore, to ferment honey into mead was not merely a culinary act, it was, in some regions, a spiritual one. Early mead in daily life. Contrary to the image of mead as a royal or mythical drink, it was surprisingly common among early rural communities, especially where grain or grapes were scarce. The process was straightforward. Water was warmed usually in a clay pot or bronze cauldron. Honey was stirred in, often raw and unfiltered. The mixture was left to ferment, sometimes inoculated by wild yeasts or leftover fermenting substances from other brews. Herbs and spices such as meadowsweet, juniper, or elderflower might be added to balance the sweetness or for medicinal effect. In many cases, mead was drunk young, cloudy, and low in alcohol similar to weak ale. It was part of daily nutrition, served in wooden or horn cups and consumed communally. Stronger, clearer meads were reserved for special occasions, seasonal festivals, weddings, or burial feasts. Feasting and ritual, mead as ceremony. Among the Anglo-Saxons and Norse, mead held a prominent place in ritualized drinking ceremonies. The mead hall, such as the famed hearth in Beowulf, was not merely a place for indulgence. It was a center of power, law, and memory. The act of passing a mead cup, called a cymbal in Old English tradition, was highly symbolic. It was a chance for boasting and oath-making, commemorating ancestors, establishing bonds of loyalty and protection. The cup was passed clockwise, from person to person, each one speaking words of intent. This wasn't idle talk to boast of a future deed, while holding the mead cup was to bind oneself to that deed. A promise made in the mead hall was as binding as a written contract. The lady of the hall often had the honor of presenting the mead cup, underscoring the ritual's communal and familial importance. Even funeral rites included mead. The dead were sometimes buried with jars of honey wine, and mourners might drink to the departed in solemn toasts. Mead in mythology and legend. In Norse mythology, mead appears as a source of wisdom, poetry, and immortality. According to legend, there existed a mead of poetry, a divine drink brewed from the blood of the wise being Kvasir, mixed with honey. Whoever drank of it gained the power of skaldic verse and profound knowledge. This mythic mead was stolen, hidden, and eventually consumed by the god Odin, who thereby gained his famed eloquence and cunning. In Celtic traditions as well, mead was often associated with otherworldly realms. Drinking mead could grant visions, connect the drinker with the ancestors, or serve as part of druidic rituals. Even in early Christian stories, mead appears, though usually transformed, into a symbol of divine abundance. Irish monastic records mention mead miracles, in which saints cause honey to appear or mead vessels to overflow in times of need. All these tales underscore one truth: mead was more than drink, it was medium. It connected the sacred and the mundane, the living and the dead. Mead as a marriage drink, the origin of the honeymoon. One of the more enduring associations with mead is its role in weddings specifically, in the origin of the term honeymoon. The custom, recorded in both Norse and Anglo-Saxon cultures, held that newlyweds were to drink mead daily for one full moon cycle, roughly 28 days, following their wedding. This practice was believed to promote fertility, harmony, prosperity in the union. The mead itself was often specially brewed for the occasion, sometimes infused with aphrodisiac herbs like cinnamon or rose petals. The honeymoon was quite literally a honey month, a period set aside for sweetness, intimacy, and blessing. Interestingly, some early legal texts suggest that if a child was conceived during this time, it strengthened inheritance claims linking mead not just to love, but to property and lineage. Regional variations and ingredients. Mead's simplicity allowed it to be highly regionalized. What we think of as mead today could vary significantly based on local flora and brewing customs. In the British Isles, meadowsweet, heather, and hawthorn were common flavorings. In the Baltic regions, stronger meads, sometimes called medovuka, were made with added berries or roots. In the Slavic world, spiced honey drinks served both ritual and medicinal functions, often brewed with cloves, cinnamon, and hops. In the Caucasus, particularly Georgia, a hybrid of grape wine and honey was fermented in clay vessels, cuivre, underground. Some of these variants were fortified with additional alcohol or aged for years, creating complex flavors. Others were consumed quickly, cloudy and unfiltered, as a table drink. Challenges in preservation. Unlike wine or beer, mead was difficult to preserve in warm climates without sealed vessels. Without glass bottles or proper stoppers, much of the mead made in early medieval homes was consumed shortly after fermentation. This perishability meant that mead making was often seasonal, brewed during periods of honey abundance, and consumed during festivals or cold months. But this also meant that the ritual of mead was woven into the rhythms of the year. It marked time, transitions, and sacred thresholds. A drink fading into the shadows. Despite its importance in early medieval life, mead would eventually fade in prominence. As trade routes expanded and sugar became more available, as beer and wine improved in production and preservation, mead began to seem rustic, old-fashioned, and unprofitable. Still, for centuries, it held strong in pockets of tradition in rural Wales, Poland, Lithuania, and among Scandinavian farmers. Its story would not end entirely, but it would go quiet, like so many other remnants of pre-modern life. And so, as the mead cup passes once more through weathered hands and a fire crackles low, you might wonder, why did this drink of myth and memory slip so easily into obscurity? The mead hall is quieter now. The boastful voices have dimmed, replaced by the rhythms of prayer, the scribble of quills, and the soft hum of bees in hives behind the cloister walls. Honey is still gathered, but it is used more for wax and ointments than feasting. Mead has not vanished, not yet, but its role has changed. Its golden glow now flickers in the background, overshadowed by new beverages rising to prominence. The shift in taste, the rise of ale and beer. By the 11th and 12th centuries, mead's dominance as the fermented drink of the North was quietly eroding. The reasons weren't dramatic. There was no great decree, no theological condemnation, no sweeping reform. The decline came from practical changes in agriculture, economics, and taste. The biggest challenger, ale. Ale required no bees, only grain and water. And unlike honey, which was gathered in limited quantities, grains could be cultivated in abundance. The transition from forested landscapes to farmland across Europe favored barley and wheat, not wildflowers and apiaries. Brewing ale was faster, a batch could be ready in a day or two. Cheaper, it relied on staple crops rather than foraged honey. Easier to scale, particularly with larger populations and growing urban centers. Whereas mead remained seasonal, slow, and rustic, ale became the drink of daily life. Even in regions where mead had spiritual significance, such as Wales and the Baltic, ale and beer gained ground, often aided by monastic breweries that could produce large volumes. Monasteries and the repurposing of honey. Ironically, the monks who once preserved mead-making knowledge contributed to its decline. In early medieval monasteries, honey was prized, but increasingly, it was used not for mead but for candles. Beeswax candles were essential for the liturgy, especially in winter when darkness ruled. Medicinal preparations. Honey mixed with herbs became a base for ointments and syrups. Sweetening ale or wine. Rather than fermenting it alone, honey was used to enhance other beverages. By the High Middle Ages, many monastic breweries shifted entirely toward gruit ale or hopped beer, which preserved better and sold more reliably. Honey became a supporting ingredient, not the main event. Even when monks continued making mead, it was typically for special occasions, feasts of saints or abbots, gifting to nobles, ceremonial use in cloistered events. It no longer flowed through daily life, as it once had in the mead halls of old. Trade and transformation, the sugar invasion. A quiet revolution unfolded between the 12th and 15th centuries, as Europe opened itself to wider trade through crusades, pilgrimages, and port cities. Among the many goods that arrived was sugar, first as a rarity, then as a luxury, and eventually as a rival to honey. Sugar was more neutral in flavor, easier to blend with spices and fruit, shelf-stable, compact, and attractive for cooks and brewers alike. While honey was still revered, sugar's spread began to change the palate of Europe, especially among the wealthy. Mead, once a high-status drink, began to seem rustic, coarse, or overly sweet compared to the more refined, spiced, and clear beverages now available. Urban populations turned toward sweetened wines, cordials, and imported drinks that aligned with new ideas of sophistication. Mead was increasingly pushed to the countryside, to small farms and isolated villages. It began to be remembered less as an everyday necessity, and more as a folk relic, a drink tied to heritage, festivals, and nostalgia. Folklore festivals and the mead that remained. Though mead faded from commerce, it lived on in oral traditions and seasonal rituals. In Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and Scandinavia, mead continued to be brewed for harvest festivals, weddings, midwinter feasts, pagan and Christian syncretic ceremonies. Sometimes known by local names like metheglin from the Welsh medeglin, meaning healing liquor, these brews were infused with herbs, roots, or spices. They were not refined products, they were earthy, cloudy, fermented in barrels or earthenware, and consumed communally. In Slavic lands, honey-based drinks like medovaca became essential for both pagan rites and Christian celebrations, particularly weddings and name-day feasts. In Poland and Lithuania, specific meads were aged for years, sometimes a decade, before being shared. These traditional meads were often deeply regional, reflecting local flora, fermentation styles, and family recipes. They became, quite literally, the drink of memory, stored in jars in the cellar, passed down as both beverage and story. Mead in literature and memory. Though mead declined in use, it remained potent in the imagination. Epic poetry and legends continued to place mead at the center of mythical moments. In Beowulf, mead is not only a drink, but the symbol of community, of trust and threat, of glory and doom. In Norse sagas, the mead hall is the last bastion of civilization before monsters or fate intrude. In Welsh literature like the Mabinogion, mead flows in the courts of heroes, linking past and present through ritual. These texts preserved not only the idea of mead, but also the idea of a time when sharing a drink bound people together through promises, poetry, and place. As literacy expanded and oral traditions gave way to manuscripts, mead became a metaphor, evoking a world of harmony, honor, and human warmth, all disappearing under the weight of war, trade, and mechanization. Mead's final retreat. By the 17th century, mead was no longer a competitor in the marketplace of drinks. In England, beer and gin ruled the taverns. In France and Spain, wine reigned, refined by monastic and merchant vintners alike. In Germany, lager beers began to dominate. Mead remained only in folk medicine, as a tonic or digestive. Rural brewing, especially among elderly or isolated communities. Cultural memory, invoked in ballads, poems, and seasonal pageants. Ironically, its very lack of modern refinement saved it. Because it never industrialized, mead remained untouched by the pollution, taxation, and adulteration that plagued many mass-produced beverages in the early modern period. But it also meant that mead became invisible to the historians of commerce and kings. It slipped from ledgers, from cookbooks, from chronicles. What remained were whispers of brew spoken of, rather than drunk. The question of decline. As we reach the late stages of mead's medieval journey, we must ask, was mead's disappearance a sign of progress or a quiet cultural loss? Was the transition to ale and beer purely logical, or did it also mark the end of a way of thinking, one where drink was as much about memory and meaning as it was about nourishment? Mead faded, not because it was inferior, but because it did not scale, did not commercialize, did not align with the speed and needs of the modern world. It remained a drink of margins of forests, farms, feasts, and folklore. And yet, even in its retreat, it laid roots deep in the collective soul. Somewhere in a quiet workshop, modern hands reach for a wooden spoon. Honey warms in a steel pot. A jar of herbs is uncorked. Fermentation bubbles begin slow, ancient, familiar. Once lost to obscurity, mead now stirs again. But this is not just a return to drink. It is a return to memory, to myth, to meaning. The unexpected rebirth. In the late 20th century, after centuries of silence, mead began to reappear. It wasn't in royal courts or rural kitchens at first, but in unexpected places. The homes of hobbyist brewers, booths at Renaissance fairs, and the notebooks of curious historians and anthropologists. People wanted something old, something rooted, something slow. And mead was all of those things. By the 1990s, a global mead revival was underway. Small-scale producers, inspired by medieval recipes and mythic lore, began crafting honey wines that echoed the past but also embraced innovation. Some added fruit, some infused spices, others experimented with aging methods unknown to the ancient world. Mead re-entered the marketplace not as a competitor to beer or wine, but as an alternative, a link to lost traditions. It found particular popularity in craft brewing circles, alongside sour ales and barrel-aged stouts; pagan and neo-Druidic communities, where ancient rituals were being revived; fantasy and historical fandoms, where Tolkien and Norse myth had kept the idea of mead alive in the imagination. No longer forgotten, mead became curious, then cool, then for some sacred again. Craft mead, old methods, new tools. What defines modern mead is not mass production, but intentionality. Craft meaderies, often founded by individuals with deep historical or scientific interests, blend traditional ingredients with modern technology. They may source raw, local honey, unfiltered and minimally processed. Use controlled yeast strains, isolating the fermentation process once guided only by wild airborne spores. Introduce carbonation, making sparkling meads. Age meads in bourbon, wine or oak barrels to add complex notes. Create melomels, mead with fruit, metheglins, mead with herb spices, and piments mead with grapes. These categories existed in medieval times, but now they are formalized, labeled, and appreciated with the same sophistication once reserved for fine wine. The result is not a drink trying to reclaim dominance, but one offering a different pace, slower, more thoughtful, closer to the land. The language of myth revisited. One of the most intriguing aspects of mead's revival is the resurgence of its mythic language. Modern meaderies often name their products after Norse gods Odin's gift, Mjolnir mead; Celtic festivals, Samhain sweet, Beltane blaze; legendary creatures, Dragon's breath, Elf blossom. This isn't just branding. It reflects a longing not necessarily for the beliefs of the past, but for the depth they represented. In an age of speed, people yearn for ritual, story, and symbolism, and mead provides all three. Drinking mead is often framed not as consumption, but as participation, in tradition, in history, in something older than the self. Mead and the rise of ancestral foodways. In recent years, mead has joined the broader movement of ancestral foodways, a trend dedicated to reviving the forgotten diets, recipes, and fermentation techniques of earlier generations. Alongside sourdough, fermented vegetables, heirloom grains, wild brewing, mead has become part of a culinary philosophy that values slowness, local ingredients, and pre-industrial wisdom. Workshops, books, and online communities now teach people how to make mead at home not as a novelty, but as a way of life. They emphasize the microbiology of wild fermentation, the role of terroir in honey flavor, since bees forage locally, the rhythms of the seasons in brewing cycles. These are not just recipes, they are reconstructions of mindset. In this sense, the revival of mead is also a revival of perspective, one where nature is not a resource to extract from, but a partner in the act of creation. Indigenous and global honey wines. Interestingly, mead's rebirth has also prompted recognition of non-European honey wines that were historically marginalized or overlooked. In Ethiopia, for instance, tej, a honey wine flavored with gesho leaves, has been made for millennia. It is often consumed during celebrations, and its brewing methods vary from household to household. In Mexico, the Mayan balché, a fermented drink made with honey and tree bark, has ancient ceremonial roots. In parts of Asia, fermented honey drinks appear in cultural rituals and rural medicines. As interest in mead expands, so too does acknowledgement of its diversity. The European medieval mead hall is only one expression of honey fermentation. There are dozens of ancestral honey drinks, each shaped by climate, flora, belief, and need. This pluralism enriches the story and decenters the assumption that mead belongs solely to Vikings and bards. It is, instead, a human drink, universal in its simplicity and sacredness. Mead in the modern market, obstacles and opportunity. Despite the growing interest, mead remains a niche product. Challenges include regulatory hurdles. In some countries, mead is categorized inconsistently as beer, wine, something else, making licensing and taxation complex. Consumer awareness. Many people still don't know what mead is or assume it's overly sweet or unsophisticated. Ingredient costs. High-quality honey is expensive, especially when sourced ethically. Yet these same challenges are what give mead its character. It is a drink that resists mass commodification. It demands attention, care, and time. And slowly, that time is returning. Meaderies now appear in dozens of countries, often rooted in local ecology and history. Some collaborate with beekeepers, some with herbalists, some with storytellers and poets. Each glass becomes a conversation between past and present, sweet, strong, and slow. A cup of reflection. To drink mead today is not just to taste honey and alcohol. It is to taste the labor of bees, collecting nectar from 1,000 flowers. The hand of a medieval farmer, straining a cloudy brew by firelight. The voice of a Norse skald, composing verse over a brimming horn. The whisper of ritual, oath, and celebration beneath ancient stars. It is a reminder that the things we call simple, honey, water, time, can be transformed into something profound if we allow them to ferment. What lingers in the mead? Mead was never meant to dominate shelves or fuel empires. It was meant to connect. To connect people to each other through feasts, rituals, and toasts. People to land through bees, herbs, and seasons. People to story through myth, poetry, and memory. It went quiet, but it never truly died. And as the modern world searches for roots in the soil and symbols in the cup, mead flows once again, not with grandeur, but with grace. Story 4. The Spiced Cup: How Mulled Wine Became Medicine. The air is cold and heavy with the scent of cloves and damp stone. In the dim corner of a merchant's house, a pot simmers over the fire, red wine laced with cinnamon, ginger, and peppercorns. The windows are shuttered against winter's bite, and those who gather hold cups close to their lips, not just for comfort, but for health. This is mulled wine. And in the medieval world, it is more than a festive indulgence. It is a form of medicine, a gesture of warmth in an age of cold and fear. Before the spice, wine as a base, not a beverage. In medieval Europe, wine was both common and variable. It was rarely consumed in its purest form, especially among the middle and lower classes. Instead, it was diluted with water, mixed with herbs, heated with spices, preserved with resins or smoke. The wine itself was often sour, cloudy, or oxidized, particularly outside of the elite domains of France, Italy, or Iberia. Without corks, bottles, or refrigeration, storage was inconsistent. What arrived at a tavern or apothecary was often barely palatable on its own. And so people adapted. They transformed bad wine into good medicine, or at least into a tolerable, warming tonic. From this necessity, and from a growing trade in imported spices, the tradition of mulled wine, known in Latin as vinum candidatum or claritum, emerged. The medical logic of mulled wine. To understand why wine was spiced and heated, one must first understand the medical worldview of the medieval period. European medicine was based on the ancient humoral system, derived from Greek and Roman physicians like Hippocrates, Galen, and later, elaborated by Avicenna and medieval scholars. This system proposed that the body was governed by 4 humors: blood hot and wet, phlegm cold and wet, yellow bile hot and dry, black bile cold and dry. Health was believed to come from balancing these humors, and foods, drinks, and behaviors were all thought to affect that balance. In this framework, spiced wine was considered hot and dry, good for balancing cold or phlegmatic disorders, stimulating to the digestion, helpful in preventing miasmas, the bad airs believed to spread disease. Doctors and apothecaries frequently prescribed warm, spiced wine to improve circulation, relieve melancholy, aid digestion, soothe menstrual cramps, combat the chill of winter, especially among the elderly. Warming the wine was key. Heat increased its perceived virtue, making it more potent and more compatible with delicate or aging bodies. In this sense, mulled wine was closer to a potion than a pleasure. The apothecary's cauldron, common ingredients. What went into mulled wine varied by region, wealth, and occasion, but certain ingredients appear again and again in medieval recipes and texts. Cinnamon, imported from Ceylon, Sri Lanka, prized for its warming and antiseptic qualities. Cloves, believed to strengthen the stomach and heart. Ginger, used to open the body and drive out internal cold. Galangal, a relative of ginger, popular in Arab and Persian medicine. Black pepper, a stimulant, often used in small quantities. Mace and nutmeg, from the Banda Islands, considered highly exotic and expensive. Sugar or honey, to sweeten and preserve the drink. Saffron, sometimes used for color, and believed to improve mood and circulation. These spices were not just flavorings, they were part of the materia medica, the medicinal materials cataloged in every apothecary's book. To add them to wine was to create a tonic, a drinkable remedy that could be dosed, adjusted, and prescribed. Recipes from the past, claret and hippocras. Two primary categories of spiced wine emerged in the medieval world. Claret or claria derived from Latin vinum claratum, meaning clarified wine. Typically white wine or light red wine, mixed with honey, cinnamon, and often roses or herbs. Sometimes strained through cloth to remove solids. Served warm or at room temperature. Popular among the nobility during feasts and holidays. Hippocras, named after Hippocrates, and sometimes strained through a cloth called a Hippocratic sleeve. Made with red wine, sugar, and a blend of warming spices. Considered stronger and more medicinal. Often served after meals to aid digestion. These recipes appear in medical texts, household guides, and even monastic records, suggesting that spiced wine was both medicine and merriment, crossing the boundary between physician's draft and festive beverage. The influence of Arab and Persian medicine. It is no accident that many of the spices used in mulled wine come from far beyond Europe. From the 9th to the 13th century, the Islamic world led advancements in medical science, pharmacology, and chemistry. Scholars like Avicenna Ibn Sina wrote encyclopedic works, such as the Canon of Medicine, which were widely translated and studied in medieval Europe. These texts often detailed the energetic properties of spices, how to compound herbal remedies in wine, the medicinal value of fermentation. As a result, European physicians, particularly those trained in southern France, Italy, and Spain, began to adopt and adapt these ideas. The result was a hybrid tradition, Galenic medicine flavored with Islamic spice knowledge, preserved in monastic scriptoria and urban apothecaries, and steeped in wine. Spiced wine and plague prevention. By the 14th century, fear stalked every city street and rural road in Europe. The Black Death, the bubonic plague, arrived in 1347 and killed millions in waves over the next century. In this context, spiced wine became more than a comfort, it was a defense. Plague doctors and medical theorists recommended drinking warm spiced wine in the morning to open the pores and purge the body. Carrying pomanders or soaking cloth in wine infused with herbs and spices to breathe through in foul-smelling areas. Soaking sponges in spiced wine and vinegar to cleanse the air. Some even suggested bathing in herbal wines, or using them in fumigations, burning wine-soaked herbs to clear rooms of miasmas. Whether or not these methods worked is, of course, doubtful, but they reflect a deep-seated belief that wine plus spice equals protection, both physical and spiritual. Luxury class and access. It must be noted, spiced wine was not universally available. The cost of imported spices, and sometimes of the wine itself, made it a drink of the elite. Nobles, bishops, and wealthy merchants were most likely to drink mulled or clarified wines regularly. The poor, if they drank spiced wine at all, made do with weak ale warmed with local herbs like sage or rosemary. Honeyed drinks with crushed berries and garden spices. Boiled wine, often of low quality, consumed immediately. Nevertheless, the idea of spiced wine, its warmth, its scent, its associations permeated medieval culture. Even when inaccessible, it symbolized care, health, and hospitality. To offer mulled wine was to say, "You are safe here, you are valued, may you be well." But even as its reputation grew, one wonders, would spiced wine remain a drink of healing, or become just another holiday indulgence, stripped of its sacred associations. The fire crackles in a manor hearth. Outside, frost clings to the branches of bare trees. Inside, servants carry trays of warm, fragrant cups. A guest raises his to his lips red wine, mulled with sugar, cloves, and orange peel. Music plays softly. This is a winter feast, and the drink being passed from hand to hand has traveled a long journey from dusty apothecary shelves to the heart of holiday tradition. Mulled wine and the turn towards celebration. As the medieval period gave way to the early modern age, the role of spiced wine began to shift. No longer primarily prescribed by physicians or concocted behind monastery walls, mulled wine entered the domestic and social sphere. It became part of seasonal customs, particularly surrounding winter, a time when warmth was precious, illness threatened, and gatherings helped fend off loneliness and cold. In this period, roughly from the 15th to the 17th century, we see spiced wine evolve from medicine to merriment. And as it did, it began to change in form, flavor, and meaning. The rise of winter feasting. The late medieval period saw the rise of seasonal festivities tied to both religious and pagan calendars. Christmas, newly emphasized by the Church as a major feast. Twelfth Night, marking the end of the 12 days of Christmas. Yule in the Nordic and Anglo-Saxon traditions, blending old solstice rites with Christian celebration. Wassailing, an English tradition involving singing and drinking to orchards for a good harvest. In each of these celebrations, warm, spiced drinks played a central role not just for pleasure, but for symbolic warmth, hospitality, and health. It was in this context that mulled wine became a staple, passed in bowls or mugs, served from steaming pots, often accompanied by spices and seasonal fruits like apples or oranges. Wassail, a cousin to mulled wine. One of the key transitional beverages between medicinal spiced wine and festive mulled drinks was wassail, from the Old English was hall, meaning be healthy. Wassail was a spiced, warm alcoholic drink, sometimes wine-based but often cider or ale-based. Flavored with nutmeg, cinnamon, ginger, and toasted bread or apples. Served in large communal bowls and shared with neighbors, often door to door. Wassailing became both a caroling tradition and a blessing ritual, especially for orchards. In some versions, people sang to apple trees and poured wassail onto the roots to ensure a bountiful harvest. Though wassail was often ale-based, wine-based wassail was considered more refined, favored by the upper classes. This mingling of ritual, social drinking, and seasonal cheer set the stage for mulled wine to become a staple of the holiday hearth. Spiced wine in the Tudor and Stuart eras. Under the Tudors and Stuarts, 16th-17th centuries, English society embraced a luxurious, spice-laden style of festivity, especially among the nobility. During Christmas and New Year's celebrations, large feasts were held with multiple courses, plays, music, and boiled or roasted meats. At these gatherings, mulled wine, often called lamb's wool or claret, was served. Warmed gently over the hearth. Flavored with a blend of sugar, nutmeg, mace, cloves, and occasionally orange peel. Sometimes thickened with eggs or cream, like an early posset. Garnished with toasted bread or fruit, floating in the cup. The line between dessert, medicine, and drink was blurred. Cookbooks and household manuals of the time began including recipes for spiced wine or bishop's wine, no longer as treatments, but as delicacies for guests. This era marks a key turning point. Mulled wine becomes not just healthful but fashionable. The arrival of citrus and sugar. The 17th century also brought two important additions to the European pantry. Refined sugar, from colonies in the Caribbean and Brazil. Oranges and lemons, from Spain and North Africa, increasingly available to northern markets. These ingredients transformed the profile of mulled wine. Sugar replaced honey, offering a more neutral sweetness. Citrus peel added a sharp, fragrant acidity that balanced heavy spices. Orange or lemon juice sometimes replaced vinegar in recipes meant to brighten older wine. This version of mulled wine became particularly popular in France, England, and the Netherlands, where colonial trade routes made such ingredients more accessible. It also made the drink more colorful and aromatic, aligning with changing tastes and a growing desire for spectacle at the table. Mulled wine in class. By the 18th century, mulled wine had a firm place in both aristocratic and middle-class households, particularly during winter. Among the upper classes, it was associated with leisure and comfort, drawing room service in silver pots, accompanying dessert courses or evening gatherings. Among the emerging middle class, it became a symbol of aspiration, a way to emulate noble hospitality on a smaller scale. But what of the working class? There, mulled wine took on a simpler, humbler form still tied to health and warmth more than elegance. Recipes were often handed down orally and made do with whatever was at hand. Cheap red wine, leftover spices, maybe a spoonful of sugar. It was a drink of winter necessity, not of festivity alone. Charles Dickens and the cementing of a tradition. It is impossible to discuss mulled wine's modern place without invoking Charles Dickens. In his 1843 novella A Christmas Carol, Dickens paints a picture of Victorian Christmas full of warmth, family, and generosity, with hot spiced drinks at the center of it all. One drink mentioned is Smoking Bishop, a variation of mulled wine made with red wine, port, Seville oranges, cloves and cinnamon, a final roasting or smoking of the citrus before steeping. Dickens helped reframe Christmas not just as a religious holiday, but as a moral and familial event, one in which sharing warm food and drink became a metaphor for compassion. Thanks to Dickens and the Victorian revival of Christmas traditions, mulled wine became enshrined as a seasonal ritual, especially in English-speaking cultures. A cup at the crossroads. By the late 19th century, mulled wine had fully transitioned from medicine to tonic right arrow to treat right arrow to tradition. It was no longer prescribed by physicians or reserved for the elite. It had become an expectation, a marker of winter gatherings, and eventually, a nostalgic gesture in the age of industrialization. Still, its origins in health and ritual were not forgotten. In rural areas of Europe, especially in Germany, Austria, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe, hot-spiced wine was still believed to ward off colds, ease the chest, improve circulation, strengthen the heart in the darkest months. In this way, the symbolic warmth of mulled wine persisted, even as its context changed. But with the world modernizing rapidly, one question remained. Would this ancient spiced remedy remain relevant in a new era of science and refrigeration, or would it fade into quaint sentiment? Snow taps against the window pane. Inside, the room glows with candlelight. A saucepan simmers gently on the stove, filling the air with the unmistakable scent of clove, cinnamon, and orange peel steeped in red wine. The drink is familiar, but its origins are not. Few who lift the cup know they are sipping a 2,000-year-old remedy. This is mulled wine today. More than a beverage, it is memory made liquid. The 20th century, from custom to commercial. As the 20th century unfolded, the world changed faster than ever before. Industrialization, global war, and scientific advancement redefined the way people ate, drank, and healed. Mulled wine, once a home remedy and then a festive indulgence, now had to find its place in a world of pasteurized beverages, pharmaceutical medicine, central heating. It no longer served a vital medicinal role, not in a literal sense. Antibiotics and vaccines replaced cloves and cinnamon. Warm homes reduced the need for heating beverages. And yet, the ritual remained. In Germany and Austria, Glühwein, meaning glow wine, became a standard offering at Christmas markets. Often served in small ceramic mugs with festive patterns, it provided not just warmth but community. People gathered outdoors in the cold, drinking together, re-establishing human connection. In Scandinavia, glögg continued its own traditions, sometimes with almonds, raisins, or cardamom. Recipes varied from family to family. Bottled versions became available, but many still made it by hand during the darkest part of the year. And in Britain, the Victorian revival of Christmas, thanks to Dickens and the royal family, preserved mulled wine as part of seasonal celebration, often appearing in cookbooks, carols, and holiday films. Memory in a mug. By the mid-20th century, the practical uses of mulled wine had faded, but its symbolic resonance deepened. Across cultures, the act of heating spiced wine became associated with nostalgia for hearths, holidays, and handmade hospitality. Simplicity, a return to slow methods in an age of speed. Belonging, shared cups at shared tables. While few modern drinkers consciously think of humoral theory or miasma when sipping their mulled wine, what they often do feel is comfort. That comfort is not just physical, it is cultural, emotional, even ancestral. There is a peculiar intimacy in the act of making mulled wine. It cannot be rushed. It must be watched, stirred, tasted. Its fragrance fills the home before a single drop is sipped. That fragrance alone can trigger memory of childhood kitchens, snowbound evenings, or bustling holiday markets. In this way, mulled wine became a sensory heirloom, passed not in books, but in scent, warmth, and ritual. A global journey reimagined. While Europe has been the historical epicenter of mulled wine, globalization has expanded its reach. Today, variations appear in Japan, where hot wine bars serve lightly spiced versions in winter. The United States, where cider and wine are often combined, especially in New England traditions. South Korea, where a recent trend in Western holiday aesthetics has introduced mulled wine kits during Christmas markets. Latin America, where sweet spiced drinks like punch, fruit punch with cloves and cinnamon, share a similar seasonal function. In each case, the drink adapts, not always with wine, not always with the same ingredients, but always with the same core purpose: warmth, togetherness, and a defense against winter's darkness. Craft revival and the new artisans. In recent decades, a new generation has rediscovered the roots of mulled wine, not just as a seasonal treat, but as a culinary heritage worth honoring. Artisan winemakers and chefs now experiment with ancient recipes for Hippocras, made with historical spice blends. Regional variations using local herbs like rosemary, lavender, or even peppercorn. Non-alcoholic mulled drinks, using grape juice, tea, or cider, expanding accessibility. Books, food blogs, and television shows dive into the history of spiced wine, reconnecting the modern audience with its medicinal and symbolic past. In this way, mulled wine is not merely surviving. It is being reclaimed not as a product, but as a practice. A drink that teaches us to slow down. In a time of ever-accelerating convenience, mulled wine offers something stubbornly unhurried. It cannot be microwaved to proper effect. It resists being bottled and sold at scale without losing something intangible. To make it is to engage in preparation, choosing spices, cutting fruit, selecting wine. Patience, waiting for it to warm, for flavors to mingle. Presence, sharing it hot before it cools in the moment. In these ways, mulled wine remains a teacher even now. It insists that care and time matter, even in small things. Just as the medieval physician carefully balanced cinnamon and wine to bring harmony to the humors, the modern host balances flavors to bring harmony to the home. From plague to peace. It's easy to forget that this simple drink was once part of a serious arsenal against death, passed from physician to patient in hopes of fending off plague or melancholy. And yet it worked in another way. Perhaps mulled wine did not cure the body, but it soothed the soul. It warmed the chest, loosened the tongue, offered sweetness in bitter times. It did what the best remedies do: not eradicate pain, but reintroduce joy. Today, that same quality endures. Whether in a bustling market, a quiet kitchen, or a flickering Christmas Eve gathering, mulled wine is still a drink of healing, not for the flesh, but for the feeling of being cared for. A final sip. In the end, the story of mulled wine is not just about ingredients or recipes. It is about adaptation from medicine to ritual, survival through plague, scarcity, and change, memory preserved in scent, warmth, and the shared cup. Its journey is a quiet one, a story told not in grand battles or decrees, but in kitchens and cellars, passed from hand to hand. It reminds us that comfort can be crafted, health can be cultural, and history can be tasted. So the next time you sip mulled wine, perhaps while snow falls, or friends laugh nearby, pause a moment. What you hold is not just a cup of warm wine. It is a 2,000-year-old tradition, still alive. Story 5. Bitter waters, purification, brewing, and the fear of contaminated wells. The bucket is heavy. Drawn from the village well, it sloshes against rough wooden sides. A woman carries it back across the frost-hardened ground. She doesn't drink from it, not directly. Instead, she pours it into a cauldron, adds grain or herbs, and sets it to boil. In the medieval world, water is never just water. It is a gamble, a source of life and of death. A peril in plain sight. To modern eyes, clean water is assumed. You open a tap, it flows, clear, cold, safe. In the medieval world, water was anything but guaranteed. It was contaminated easily by waste, rot, or animals. Stagnant in ponds and rain barrels. Discolored, full of sediments, organic matter, or tannins from wooden containers. And while the concept of germs was unknown, people were not foolish. They understood that some water made people sick. They didn't always know why. But they knew. Wells, rivers, and the hierarchy of sources. In a typical medieval village, access to water depended heavily on geography, wealth, and infrastructure. Water sources included wells dug by hand, lined with stone or wood, and often shallow, easily contaminated by surface runoff, especially if latrines or animal pens were nearby. Streams and rivers, preferred if they were fast-moving, as they washed away foulness. But these were also downstream from other villages or monasteries. Rainwater, collected from rooftops, often stored in barrels, fresh but limited. Public fountains. In cities, sometimes fed by aqueducts or cisterns, but prone to algae and misuse. Natural springs, rare but revered, often believed to be sacred or healing. People developed preferences and taboos. Water from a cold, bubbling spring was prized. Stagnant pond water was avoided. Wells were a blessing and a risk. Water as a source of fear. Though medieval people lacked microbiology, they had generations of observation. They associated water with plague outbreaks, fevers and fluxes, diarrheal diseases, sudden deaths after floods or heavy rains. Some towns had ordinances forbidding the washing of clothes or slaughtering of animals near wells. Monasteries wrote about the importance of keeping aqueducts clear of dead birds, frogs, and silt. And yet contamination was hard to avoid. Latrines were often no more than shallow pits, sometimes adjacent to the very water sources they were meant to support. In cities, cesspits leaked, and chamber pots were dumped into streets. Runoff found its way into watercourses. No wonder people turned to boiling, brewing, or fermenting. Water alone was dangerous. The preference for fermented liquids. From the peasant's small beer to the monk's light wine, fermented drinks were the daily default, not the exception. Small ale, brewed to be barely alcoholic 1–2%, consumed throughout the day even by children. Pasca, a Roman legacy vinegar diluted in water still used in parts of Europe, sharp tasting but safe. Wine diluted with herbs, not strong but boiled and spiced, made water safer and more palatable. These drinks offered hydration, nutrition especially if grain-based, preservation, alcohol or acid discouraged microbial growth, and crucially, peace of mind. You didn't worry that your ale was hiding invisible death. Water and religion, a cleansing symbol with a dirty reality. It's notable that in religious life, water was sacred, used in baptism, blessings, holy wells and pilgrimage sites. And yet, the water used for daily survival was feared. This tension ran deep. People prayed at sacred springs but avoided the village well after a bad harvest. They crossed themselves before drinking or offered a drop to the ground in appeasement. Superstition and sanitation intertwined. In places where springs were unusually clean, they were sometimes declared miraculous. Saints were said to appear near clear water or to cleanse a spring that had gone foul. City water, a growing problem. As towns grew in the 12th and 13th centuries, water infrastructure became more complex and more dangerous. Aqueducts were restored or built, especially in Italy, bringing water from miles away. Cisterns collected rainwater from public buildings. Fountains served as shared access points, often elaborately carved. But city life also meant overcrowding, poor waste disposal, limited hygiene knowledge. As a result, urban populations often turned to beer, diluted wine, or even milk and broth rather than risk a cup of plain water. In some cases, water was filtered through cloth, sand, or charcoal, but these were rare and inconsistent. The invisible threat. Without germ theory, medieval people developed their own language for waterborne illness. Corrupted humors, bad airs, miasmas, putrid qualities, unwholesome vapors rising from wells. And though these terms seem unscientific, they reflected real observation. When a town's well turned, people noticed the pattern. Cattle fell ill, children died, stomachs churned, fever spread. They feared what they could not see, and they built customs around avoiding it. Survival by substitution. So why didn't they fix the water? Because they couldn't. Engineering was expensive, land was owned, labor was scarce, and most people didn't control their environment, they adapted instead. Boil it, ferment it, mix it with herbs, add vinegar, pray. People survived not because they purified water, but because they learned to live without relying on it directly. And those who drank only water, the poor, the desperate, the uninformed, were often the ones who died first in outbreaks. But even as brewing, boiling, and blessing kept people alive, one question lingered in village minds. Was there a way to make water truly safe, or was it forever cursed beneath the surface? The pot hisses softly over the fire. A woman leans in, scooping water into a jug to cool. Her family will drink this, but not as it is, not raw. It will become broth, ale, or steeped with herbs. Around her, others do the same, boiling, mixing, hopping. In an age without filters, tanks, or microscopes, water is not trusted, it is transformed. Boiling as protection, intuition before science. Although medieval people had no concept of bacteria, they understood the power of heat. Boiling water, a practice seen in many parts of Europe and Asia, was an instinctive form of protection, especially in wealthier or more educated households. Boiled broth, water combined with bones, vegetables, herbs, or grains, became nourishing and safe. Herbal infusions, people steeped sage, mint, thyme, and fennel in hot water, a precursor to tea. Wine and water mixtures, heated gently. were believed to refine water and release its impurities. These preparations served both culinary and medicinal purposes, and they made even stagnant or questionable water palatable and comforting. The brewing household. One of the most widespread solutions to unsafe water was brewing, a domestic skill that often defined a medieval household. From the 9th to the 15th century, brewing was usually done by women, often referred to as alewives. We met them earlier, of course, but in the context of water safety, their role was vital. Brewing involved boiling large quantities of water with grain. The process created a mildly alcoholic drink, but more importantly, it ensured the liquid was cooked and cooled, making it far safer than untreated water. Ale was nutritive, sometimes thick like porridge, and consumed throughout the day. In cities, brewers often operated public houses or taverns, but in villages, brewing was done in the home, batch by batch, to supplement meals and provide hydration for the entire family, including children. Small ale or table beer often had alcohol levels below 2%. It wouldn't intoxicate, but it would nourish and hydrate without harm. The power of fermentation. Beyond ale, fermentation was applied in a range of drinks. Whey and milk drinks, slightly soured but safe. Cider and perry, made from apples and pears. Mead, honey-based and slightly antiseptic. Vinegar-based drinks like pasca, carried over from Roman military traditions. Each of these relied on natural or introduced yeasts to transform water from a threat into a benefit. Fermentation also introduced lactic acid, alcohol, and carbonation, all of which discouraged the growth of harmful pathogens, though people didn't know that in technical terms. People drank these liquids not for pleasure alone, but for self-preservation. The role of the church. The church, especially monasteries, played a significant role in promoting and institutionalizing safer beverages. Monks, often literate and connected to classical knowledge, preserved and experimented with methods of safe liquid preparation. They brewed beer in large quantities, especially in Northern Europe, where wine was less viable. Created tonics and elixirs steeped in wine, vinegar, or distilled spirits, once distillation arrived. Maintained controlled wells and aqueducts, particularly in wealthier abbeys. Monasteries often provided better water access than nearby towns, and travelers preferred to drink at monastic guesthouses for this reason. In some cases, holy water from certain wells or springs was believed to be miraculously pure, though in reality, it may have simply been a well-maintained spring with fewer contaminants. Folk remedies and local customs. Beyond structured brewing and monastic practices, people developed local methods to mitigate water dangers. Filtering through cloth, linen, or wool was used to strain out visible debris. Herbal drops, tinctures, or infusions were added to water to mask foul taste or act as mild disinfectants. Charcoal, though not common, some traditions recognize charcoal's ability to purify, likely learned by observing its effects in other contexts. Boiling with iron tools. In some Slavic regions, hot iron objects were dropped into boiling water, believed to cleanse it symbolically, and perhaps even releasing trace minerals. Many of these practices were trial and error, passed orally through generations. They may not have eliminated every pathogen, but they improved survival odds, especially during hot months or post-flood periods. Public responses, laws, and infrastructure. Some medieval cities attempted proactive measures to protect water. For example, London, 13th century, laws forbade butchers from dumping animal waste near the River Thames, a major water source. Paris, 14th century, regulations mandated the clearing of public fountains and restricted where people could wash clothes. Milan and Florence, early use of canals and stone aqueducts to deliver relatively clean water from upland springs. These systems were often fragile, underfunded, or ignored, but they show that municipal concern for water quality existed. Unfortunately, enforcement was inconsistent, and the growth of cities outpaced infrastructure. Water sources near industrial areas, like tanneries and dyers, were especially polluted. Water as class divider. Access to cleaner water, or alternatives to water, became a marker of status. Nobles and monks drank wine, often diluted but well-aged. Merchants could afford beer, ale, and imported drinks. The poor relied on shared wells, rivers, or cheap beer if available. In droughts or during shortages, many turned to riskier sources. This created a grim irony. The poor were forced to drink what the wealthy avoided, and so suffered higher rates of waterborne disease. During epidemics, entire city districts, often the poorest, would fall ill, while monasteries or noble estates fared better due to better storage, cleaner practices, or access to fermented alternatives. The arrival of distillation. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, distillation entered the European consciousness, likely introduced through Arabic medical texts. At first, distilled alcohol, aqua vitae, was used only in medicine, but soon people began adding it to water to purify, mixing it with spices and herbs, creating early versions of brandy, eau de vie, and medicinal spirits. This technology marked the beginning of a shift, from survival through brewing to survival through controlled chemistry. Though not widespread among peasants, it added another method to the toolkit of safety, one based on fire, not fermentation. Inheritance of habit. By the late medieval period, many people no longer thought of water as drink at all. Children grew up expecting ale at meals, broth when sick, and cider in autumn. This cultural shift away from water lasted for centuries. Even in 18th century England, tea only became popular once it was brewed with boiled water, effectively continuing the tradition of making water safe through ritual preparation. What began as survival became habit, and then heritage. But as cities grew larger and disease spread faster, the question remained: could medieval society ever truly make water safe, or would fear remain a permanent ingredient in every bucket? The pitcher sits full on the table, but no one drinks. A neighbor's child has fallen ill. Rumors spread the well has gone bad. Someone swears they saw a dead rat pulled from the bucket. The family turns instead to ale, thin and sour, but safe. In the medieval world, drinking water is a decision fraught with danger, and the consequences of getting it wrong are devastating. When the wells went bad. Throughout medieval Europe, water-related illness was a common and terrifying occurrence, even if no one used that language. They called it the bloody flux, the shaking fever, putrid humors, or simply the death that starts in the stomach. Behind these names were dysentery, cholera-like diarrheal diseases, typhoid, and in some cases, even plague outbreaks worsened by poor sanitation. In villages and cities alike, contaminated wells led to rapid outbreaks that decimated entire neighborhoods, especially during summer months, floods, or war. When a well turned, it might be due to surface runoff carrying feces or waste into shallow stone-lined shafts, dead animals, sometimes unseen, falling into the water, nearby cesspits leaking into groundwater, heavy rainfall, stirring up silt and releasing trapped toxins. People didn't understand bacteria, but they observed cause and effect. Many townsfolk would avoid a well after someone died, regardless of whether others called it superstition. Over time, a sense of instinctive avoidance developed. And yet, options were limited. City outbreaks and the limits of brewing. In dense urban environments, London, Paris, Prague, Florence, contamination was constant. Even when people tried to rely on ale or wine, the reality was fermented drinks were expensive, especially in hard times. Brewery waste often contributed to pollution, as used grain was dumped into waterways. Disease spread quickly, aided by tight housing, shared wells, and poor ventilation. Records from monastic infirmaries and city death rolls show a seasonal pattern of deaths linked to fluxes and consumptions illnesses that started in the gut and ended in the grave. Doctors at the time tried to treat these with clove syrup, mastic gum, infusions of wormwood or sage, hot wine or vinegar mixtures meant to purge the body. But without safe water, recovery was rare. It's no surprise that by the 14th century, many medieval cities considered water itself a risk, a last resort. The Plague Years, water, air, and blame. During the Black Death, 1347–1351, water took on an even darker connotation. Though the disease was spread largely by fleas and respiratory droplets, people saw bodies piling up, dirty streets, foul-smelling air rising from sewers and wells. Many believed the vapors from corrupted water contributed to plague, part of the broader miasma theory, where bad air from rotting matter caused illness. In Florence, public fountains were drained during outbreaks. In parts of Germany and France, wells were sealed or cleansed with prayers and herbs. In England, town councils issued bans on dumping waste near rivers or wells. Water became a scapegoat and, in some cases, a weapon of blame. Tragically, some communities accused Jewish populations of poisoning wells, leading to massacres and pogroms during plague years, despite Jews often having lower mortality, perhaps due to stricter ritual cleanliness and less reliance on communal wells. Fear of water was real, and it was dangerous in more ways than one. A slow turning point, early water reforms. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, as the medieval world transitioned toward the early modern era, a new relationship with water began to form, though slowly. Some changes included urban investment in new cisterns and covered aqueducts, especially in Italian city-states. Medical texts beginning to describe the dangers of standing water and recommending boiling as standard. Household manuals advising the use of specific herbs, juniper, sage, lavender, to purify or sweeten water. These changes were not universal, and most rural communities remained wary. But the groundwork was being laid for a reassessment of water, not just as a danger to fear, but as a resource to manage. The rise of tea and the cultural shift. A particularly fascinating shift occurred in the 17th and 18th centuries, the rise of tea. Imported initially as a luxury, tea became a daily staple in England, the Low Countries, and later in Germany and France. And tea required boiling water. This seemingly small requirement had enormous public health effects. Unintentionally, the act of brewing tea with boiling water introduced millions to the daily use of heat-treated liquid, long before germ theory or sanitation infrastructure arrived. People no longer needed to rely solely on ale, though it remained popular. Instead, a hot drink culture emerged that was safer, cheaper, and conveniently healthful. This cultural shift, combined with better engineering and later industrial filtration, slowly rehabilitated water in the Western imagination. Memory, habit, and resistance. Still, in many rural areas, generational fear of water lingered. In parts of Eastern Europe, boiled milk or fruit kvass remained the standard beverage until the 20th century. In Scandinavian traditions, beer was brewed in almost every household through the 1800s. Even in American colonial settlements, well water was often suspect, and beer or cider ruled the table. It would take modern plumbing, germ theory, 19th century, and urban filtration systems to fully restore water's reputation. But the fear had roots too deep to vanish quickly. What we drink and why. Water, the most basic of all necessities, became in medieval times an object of fear, folklore, and ingenuity. Faced with the inability to trust it, people turned to fermentation, boiling, blessing, and blame. They survived not because they had clean water, but because they created cultural systems to work around the lack of it. Ale was not a luxury, it was an adaptation. Wells were not merely tools, they were loci of anxiety, central to stories of illness and salvation. And water itself, it was never neutral. A final reflection. Today, we often carry reusable bottles, trusting tap or spring with little thought. We debate filtered versus unfiltered, buy water in bottles shipped across oceans, or flavor it to taste like fruit or flowers. But our ancestors lived in a world where water was never just water. It was a question, a gamble, a daily calculation about life, health, and risk. And in the echoes of boiled tea, cold beer, or spiced wine, we still live with their solutions. Every cup we raise, hot or cold, safe or sweetened, is a distant response to the medieval fear that what should sustain us might instead bring harm. And perhaps the simplest drink of all remains the most complex of histories. Story 6. The Alewife's Ledger, Brewing, Trade, and the Women Behind the Barrel. In a smoky cottage near the edge of a market town, a woman stirs a steaming pot. The scent of malt and yeast fills the room. Beside her, a wooden ledger marked in charcoal records the price of grain and the debt of a neighbor. This is not a tavern. It is a home and also a business. The ale she brews will nourish her family and perhaps a few others if there's enough. She is an alewife, a figure both ordinary and quietly powerful in the fabric of medieval life. Brewing as a domestic necessity. In the medieval world, beer and ale were not luxury drinks. They were staples of daily life, a safer alternative to water and a source of calories, especially among the lower classes. But what's often overlooked is that brewing was women's work. Long before guilds, taverns, or professional brewmasters, brewing was a chore like baking or weaving. In almost every village, the household alewife, usually the wife, widow, or daughter, produced small batches for her family and occasionally for neighbors. She used local grain, water from a nearby well or stream, and yeast often left from previous batches or borrowed from another household. This was small-scale brewing, known as brew and sell or brew to live. The ale spoiled quickly, so it was sold and consumed within days. The drink wasn't strong 1% to 3% alcohol, but it was safe, nutritious, and crucially profitable when sold in excess. Who were the alewives? Alewives were often married women supplementing household income, widows supporting themselves in the absence of a male provider, unmarried women leveraging a skill to achieve a level of independence. Their brewing setup was modest. A copper or iron kettle, sometimes borrowed, wooden barrels or ceramic pitchers, a hearth with a drying rack for malted grain, a ledger written or memorized to track grain, sales, and debts. Many brewed no more than once a week, based on surplus grain availability, weather, cold slowed fermentation. Local events, festivals, church feasts, or funeral wakes meant more customers. For some, brewing was an occasional necessity. For others, it became a routine livelihood. Ale and economy. Ale was one of the most common currencies of exchange in the medieval village economy. You could trade ale for eggs, firewood, or cloth. Offer a jug to a neighbor for help plowing a field or mending a fence. Sell it for a few pence, helping pay rents, tithes, or taxes. The alewife's work blurred the line between domestic and commercial. Her kitchen was a brewery, her ledger a balance sheet, her reputation as vital as her recipe. In market towns, especially in England and the Low Countries, alewives sometimes scaled up, brewing weekly or even daily, setting up small tap rooms or selling jugs from a window. But this expansion brought visibility, and with it scrutiny. Regulations and ale tasters. By the 13th century, many towns had introduced strict controls on ale production. Enter the ale taster, a minor official appointed to visit homes and test the strength and quality of ale. Ensure the price per gallon matched the assize of bread and ale, a law that capped profits. Impose fines on those who watered down or overcharged for their product. Alewives were frequent targets. Historical records show fines levied on women for serving weak ale or using spoiled malt. Public shamming sometimes involving the cuckstool, a dunking chair for repeat offenders. Nomming in town rolls with phrases like Alice of Fordham for ale of dishonest measure, 2 pence. While these laws theoretically applied to all brewers, men often escaped harsher consequences, especially if part of a guild or brewing with church or landlord patronage. Alewives, by contrast, were seen as unruly, unregulated, and suspect. The gendered gaze. Much of the suspicion toward alewives had little to do with fermentation and everything to do with social control. Women earning money outside male oversight was troubling to medieval authorities. Alewives welcomed customers, often including travelers and strangers, into their homes, a moral risk. Some were rumored to water down ale, but others were accused of witchcraft, theft, or looseness. These suspicions hardened into stereotypes. By the 15th century, the wicked alewife had become a stock character in English ballads and satire. She appeared as a woman with a pitcher in one hand, the devil dragging her away in the other. A greedy figure hiding gold in her cellar. A hag-like brewer linked to poison, seduction, and fraud. This imagery persisted for centuries, shaping not just attitudes toward women in brewing, but perhaps even influencing the early iconography of witches. A respectable trade, a risky identity. Yet many alewives remained respected, even vital members of their communities. They provided nourishment in a time when water could not be trusted. They offered hospitality to neighbors and travelers alike. They managed supply chains, from grain purchases to brewing schedules. Some were even recorded as employing helpers, or passing their brewing tools and recipes to daughters and granddaughters. Still, the balance was delicate. Too much success, you were greedy. Too independent, you were dangerous. Too public, you invited trouble. For the alewife, brewing was a tightrope walk between survival and scandal. But even as women brewed, taxed, and sold ale to entire towns, one question simmered. Would they ever be seen as legitimate brewers, or forever as suspicious figures behind smoky doors? The fire is hot and the mash tun steams. The alewife leans in, her fingers stirring the thick slurry of grain and water. Her ears, though, are alert, listening for the footsteps of the ale taster. The wrong strength, the wrong price, the wrong measure, any of these could bring fines, shame, or worse. Still, she stirs. Brewing is not just her livelihood, it is her inheritance, her craft, and her quiet rebellion. Brewing with precision, or as close as one could. Unlike today's standardized beer recipes, medieval ale was highly variable, and brewing was both an art and a gamble. There was no thermometers, no hydrometers, and no precise measurements. But there were methods, often passed down through generations. Grain, mostly barley, sometimes oats or rye. Poorer brewers often used what they could afford, even stale grain. Malt, the grain was soaked, sprouted, dried over a fire or in the sun. The degree of roast affected flavor and strength. Mash, malted grain was mashed with hot water in a large vat, then left to steep. This was the most labor-intensive part. Boiling, the liquid wort, was boiled sometimes with herbs like bog myrtle, yarrow, or horehound. Hops were not common in early England. Fermentation. Yeast was often caught from the air, scraped from previous batches or gifted from another brewer. The ale was then transferred to barrels or ceramic jugs to ferment and settle. Serving. Ale was typically consumed within a few days of brewing before spoilage set in. Each step required judgment, timing, and intuition. A burned malt, a bad yeast, or too much rain all could ruin a batch. This imprecision made brewing both risky and resilient. Small changes could be hidden or accepted, and alewives developed a repertoire of adjustments to fix or mask issues. The alewife's tools. An alewife's workspace might include a brewing paddle, often large and carved with personal markings, a mash tun, typically a wooden tub with iron hoops, buckets, jugs, and sieves made of linen or wicker, a measuring stick, an early kind of dipstick for gauging liquid levels, charcoal, ash, or herbs for clarifying or flavoring the brew. The tools were often shared, borrowed, or passed between women. Some towns had communal brew kettles, especially in poorer districts or rural areas. Despite this, the brewing process remained highly individualized, and alewives guarded their preferences fiercely. One might use dried apple peel to clarify. Another, a pinch of salt to strengthen the flavor. Some wrote notes, others committed ratios to memory. In a world where the difference between drinkable and dishonest was a few hours, knowledge was as important as equipment. Recipes and regional variations. Different regions had distinct brewing customs. In northern England and Scotland, oats were common, creating a cloudy, hearty ale. In Flanders, hops were introduced earlier, lending bitterness and extending shelf life, a precursor to modern beer. In Scandinavia, honey and birch sap were sometimes added. In rural France, certain herbs were added not for taste but to calm stomachs or preserve the ale. While formal written recipes were rare, some monastic manuals and late medieval cookbooks do survive, offering cryptic entries such as: take malt well dried and steep, strain off and boil with herbs as the season allows, let stand a night, serve soon lest it turn. These texts suggest alewives often brewed seasonally, adjusting ingredients based on what grew nearby, what was cheap, and what illnesses were spreading. Ale was both drink and remedy, calming the stomach, lifting the spirit, sometimes mixed with crushed garlic or sage to open the humors. The taxing of the barrel. The assize of ale, established in England as early as the 13th century, was not just a moral code, it was a taxation scheme. Brewers had to sell at regulated prices, tied to the cost of grain. They were required to register with the manorial court and pay fees to sell publicly. Those who brewed only for home use avoided tax, but even this was increasingly monitored. For alewives, this meant constant negotiation. Sell quietly and hope no one complains. Register and risk official scrutiny. Water down the brew to stretch profit and risk punishment. Court rolls from medieval England are full of fines for brewing without license or selling at unjust prices. And once again, women bore the brunt of this enforcement. Agnes, wife of Hugh, did brew ale of false measure and is fined 4 pence. Matilda of Burton sold ale too strong and too dear and is amerced. Let it be known that Annies did brew and sell without leave. These were not trivial. Amounts a few pence could be a day's earnings. Still, women brewed because they had to. Guilds, exclusion, and the rise of professional brewing. As the medieval period wore on, brewing gradually shifted from a household chore to an industry, and women began to be pushed out. This happened through the formation of brewers' guilds in major towns, especially in London, Bruges, Cologne, and Paris. New rules requiring apprenticeships, which women were often barred from. The rise of hopped beer, which required longer fermentation, larger batches, and more capital, favoring male-led commercial operations. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Alewives who once served their communities were being replaced by male brewmasters, often working in purpose-built brewhouses, with better access to grain, tools, and legal protection. Women still brewed, especially in villages and poor neighborhoods, but their role was increasingly marginalized. Brewing was no longer women's work, it was men's business. And the alewife, she was recast no longer a craftswoman but a caricature. Cultural backlash, from alewife to villain. As women lost control of brewing, they became targets of cultural mockery. Images from the late medieval period and early modern era depict alewives as ugly hags stirring foul-smelling pots, cheats offering watered-down ale to travelers, witches with bubbling cauldrons, black cats and hidden ledgers. This shift was not accidental. It was part of a broader effort to delegitimize women's economic roles, especially in public-facing trades like brewing, midwifery, and market selling. And so the alewife, once a pillar of village life, became a figure of ridicule if not menace. Even the common pub sign, a woman with a tall hat and a broom, morphed over time into something closer to the witch archetype. One must ask, how many alewives fined and mocked later found themselves accused of darker arts? Quiet defiance and the persistence of craft. Despite all this, women continued to brew, often out of sight, sometimes illegally. They brewed for neighbors but called it sharing, traded ale for food or fuel but recorded it as gifts, passed recipes to daughters but avoided teaching sons who might later join the guilds. In the rural north, alewives brewed until the 18th century. In parts of Germany and Scandinavia, farmhouse brewing by women persisted even longer. And some, like the widowed Marjorie of Ipswich or Johanna of Ghent, petitioned city councils to allow them to brew professionally and won. The alewife's role never fully vanished. It merely retreated, waiting for safer seasons. But as brewing became more commercial, and the world tilted toward hops, industry, and regulation, one question remained. Was there still space for the alewife, or would her barrel be taken from her, one law at a time? In a market town near the edge of a wood, the brew kettle sits cold. The alewife has died, or perhaps retired, or perhaps simply been forgotten. Her tools gather dust, her ledger tucked away. In her place, a new brick brewhouse rises, larger, louder, run by men in aprons and apprentices with stamped guild letters. But in the taste of every pint drawn, something lingers. A method, a memory, a measure passed down. The alewife is gone, or is she? The great shift from ale to beer. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the commercial beer industry was ascendant across much of Europe, particularly in the Low Countries and parts of the German Empire. The key change, hops. Introduced gradually, hops added bitterness but also preservation. Whereas ale lasted only a few days, hopped beer could keep for weeks or even months. This made larger-scale brewing feasible, supporting export and long-term storage. Hops were seen as masculine, efficient, and modern, a stark contrast to the older, feminine traditions of herbed fresh ale. As the shift occurred, guilds tightened their grip, excluding most women. Cities like London passed laws favoring beerhouses over alehouses. Tax structures increasingly favored large-volume producers. Alewives who brewed small, herbed batches could not compete. Their product spoiled quickly, was taxed heavily, and was increasingly seen as old-fashioned or even dangerous. This was not a technological inevitability. It was a cultural, legal, and economic decision. And it pushed thousands of women out of a trade they had once dominated. When brewing became male, by 1550, the picture had changed dramatically. In England, male brewers ran the majority of urban operations. In the Low Countries, beer exports were handled by corporate guild brewhouses. In Germany, state laws and purity regulations, Reinheitsgebot, formalized beer as a standardized commercial product. Alewives, if they remained, were increasingly informal, brewing for local consumption; marginalized, sometimes fined for unauthorized brewing; mocked, appearing in satire and sermons as immoral or ignorant. Even the language shifted. Alewife once simply meant a woman who brewed. By the 17th century, it could imply a shrew, a scold, or a drunkard. The alewife's fall was not just economic, it was cultural erasure. A vanishing ledger. As men took over brewing, records changed. Male brewers filed formal account books, production reports, and guild petitions. Alewives had kept ledgers scratched into wax, chalked on walls, or memorized with barter tallies. These records, deemed informal, were rarely preserved. And so the alewife's history was slowly lost. Not through fire or war, but through neglect. Through the idea that women's work was not real work, and thus not worth recording. The survival of a few manorial roles, a handful of court records, and satirical prints give us glimpses, but not enough. What we do have are hints. The price of a pitcher. The name of a woman fined for her ale. A prayer scribbled on the edge of a brewing paddle. A funeral record for Maud, brewer of good strength, loved by all. Survival in the shadows. Even after their decline in towns, alewives persisted in rural villages, especially in northern England, Scandinavia, and Ireland. Isolated manors, where brewing for the household remained women's duty. Poorer urban neighborhoods, where men did not bother enforcing regulations. In these settings, brewing remained a domestic economy tied to survival, mutual support, small trade in kind. Some women brewed secretly, others sold to neighbors and called it gifting. Still others used brewing to support illegitimate children, widowed mothers, or unwed sisters. Their names are mostly lost, but their beer kept people fed. Echoes in early modern witchcraft. One of the more troubling legacies of the alewife's marginalization is its possible link to early modern witchcraft imagery. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was awash with images of old women over cauldrons, pointed hats, often tied to market women's attire, brooms, a tool of cleanliness and brewing, familiar, often cats or toads, common vermin in grain stores. The brew of the witch and the brew of the alewife were sometimes visually indistinct. This convergence was likely not accidental. It may have reflected misogynistic fears of women with economic power, suspicion of female knowledge, especially that involving fermentation, herbs, and healing, the social disruption caused by women who operated publicly without male oversight. In this way, the end of the alewife's era may have contributed to a more sinister chapter in women's history. A lasting legacy in a pint. And yet the alewife's legacy persists quietly, subtly, but powerfully. In traditional farmhouse ales still brewed in Norway, Lithuania, and Estonia, some of the techniques and recipes remain matrilineal. In the growing presence of women in craft brewing, particularly in the 21st century, there is a reclamation of lineage. In academic research, feminist historians are rebuilding the records, telling the stories once deemed too small or too domestic. Even the modern pub sign, a woman with a mug, smiling beneath a brim, can now be seen not as a mockery, but a memory. A tribute, perhaps, to those who stirred the mash by dawnlight, tracked their sails in charcoal, and kept communities hydrated when wells were unsafe. The alewife did not disappear. She was simply pushed into the background, where history forgot to look. A final reflection. Every industry has its forgotten founders. In brewing, those founders were women, unlettered, underpaid, but indispensable. They stirred pots, balanced ledgers, argued with tacksmen, and comforted the sick with warm herb drinks. And when they were no longer welcome, they left quietly but not without leaving their mark. So next time you lift a pint, consider that before hops, before lagers, before industrial beer, there was the alewife tending fire, stirring grain, and crafting safety one warm jug at a time. She brewed for survival, not for celebration, and in doing so, she became one of the earliest businesswomen in European history. Forgotten perhaps, but never truly gone.